In the year 3681 BBY, the reconstituted Sith Empire came out of seemingly nowhere and laid waste to the Galactic Republic. Led by the unfathomably powerful and equally mysterious Vitiate, the Empire had been gaining strength for 1300 years. They were the natural evolution of what the government and society would look like if the Golden Age of the Sith never ceased. Vitiate, of course, had been alive during the days of Marka Ragnos' rule, and so he simply tweaked the design and philosophy for his own new Sith Empire. In that ancient era, similar to the Jedi who had a High Council, there was a Dark Council as well. One Dark Lord, and 12 Sith who advised him and represented other provinces. Vitiate knew that he would need a Dark Council for himself if he wanted his empire to run smoothly. This would give rise to a powerful, ambitious, backstabbing circle of evil individuals that kept the Sith Empire running during an almost 4-decade-long period of war. And today, we have decided to risk our very lives to expose these secrets. Greetings again, Acolytes, and welcome back to the Archives. In today's Holocron, we have gained exclusive access to the chambers of the Dark Council so that we can detail their origins, their roles, and what purpose they actually served in the larger empire. But while we were scheming for power, we discovered that there are spies within our midst, some who are sampling our knowledge and who have not yet subscribed. If you haven't already, you should join our empire by force crushing that subscribe button. Now, let us share with you our power. The origins of the Dark Council began many millennia ago, in the year 5000 BBY. Naga Sadow has just failed the Great Hyperspace War, and Vitiate has conducted the Ritual of Nathema, the ritual wherein he called 8,000 Sith Lords to his home planet and dominated their minds, after which he forced them to participate in a ritual that siphoned not only their force energy, but all of the energy of the planet of Nathema. This not only left the planet a stormy, gray husk devoid of all life and energy and any presence in the force, but it exponentially boosted Vitiate's own power and extended his life by hundreds of years. He left Nathema and returned to the Sith world of Korriban, where the citizens of the Empire were terrified and backed into a dark corner. Vitiate cast off his old name of Vitiate and declared himself the Emperor, the name that he would go down for the next millennium. He also declared that the Great Hyperspace War was a catastrophic failure, and all those who wished to survive the coming Republic-led purge were to follow him. With the last survivors of the ancient empire, Vitiate led them on an exodus into the unknown regions, promising to take them to a new, brighter home and future. But as theorized by the Jedi Mitra Surik, he did not simply take them straight there. Instead, he took the long route and spent an inordinate amount of time to get his people to their destination. So why would he do this? During this time, the Sith would have all been forced to turn to him, looking for salvation, support, and guidance. Their dependence on him would grow until he went from becoming a leader and a hero to a literal savior of their people. Eventually, they made it to the world of Drome and Kos, and by then, the Sith people saw their emperor as an all-powerful, all-knowing deity. It was here at last in the year 4980 BBY, Vitiate selected 12 of the wisest and most powerful Sith Lords to rule the empire in his stead. He would then go on to issue them orders and to make the ultimate decisions for the wider Sith. But his attention was elsewhere, thus why he established the Council. Vitiate was not only scheming for the downfall of the Republic, but his own ascension to literal godhood. Vitiate lusted after the knowledge of true immortality, not a postponed death, and the glory of his people. In addition, he needed to prepare for the Sith Empire's return. He didn't have time to manage the day-to-day minutia of running an entire empire himself. So this was the reason and the purpose of the 12, the Dark Council, symbolizing the 12 Dark Jedi that ventured to Korriban hundreds of years prior. The 12 Dark Council members would act on orders from the Emperor and oversee the daily operations of the vast imperial civilization that was now currently only in its infancy. It was from this point where the Emperor retired into seclusion and pursued his studies and plans. And in his absence, the Dark Council were the rulers. Although the members of the Dark Council were the closest beings to the Emperor, he was anomalous to them. His absence stretched for the mere decades to centuries, and the entire generations of members of the Dark Council would never see the Emperor. Some even began to doubt his existence. There were only 2 times the Dark Council in their entire history had attempted to overthrow Vitiate. The first was actually in the first couple centuries of the Empire, when the Council banded together in hopes to usurp his his rule. They were governing the Sith anyway. The Sith by the name of Darth Plagueis was the instigator, and the Dark Lady summoned her fellow Dark Council members to a meeting, convincing them to join her plot to destroy the Emperor. But when they gathered on the steps of the Imperial Citadel to confront Vitiate, it was said that all 11 of them died instantly in a flash of light and power. Darth Plagueis herself was locked up within the depths of the Citadel by the Emperor, who tortured her until her untimely death. Thus would mark the end of the Purge of the Dark Council. But it would not be the last. The second purge came in the year 3950 BBY, where this time, 3 members of the council came together to form a conspiracy against their emperor. They had each discovered the terror and the horror of what had occurred on the planet of Nathema. The planet which the emperor had siphoned dry had become a void in the Force. All life, and even color itself, was drained from the planet. Any Force sensitive that stood long enough on the surface of the world went utterly insane, even Sith. It was an abomination to even the dark side, and they realized that their emperor was a madman, and so they sought to dethrone him. Darth Nihilus and Xendrix were the 2 that led the uprising along with 1 other Sith. And when the Emperor eventually grew suspicious, Darth Nihilus attempted to throw suspicion off of herself, but would ultimately fail. As a show of power, the Emperor summoned 9 members of the Dark Council to his chambers, 9 members who he knew were innocent and were not involved in the coup. The Emperor then promptly executed all 9 of them. He sent his personal royal guard to kill the 3 conspirators though. In the end, this would serve as a warning to the future members of the council. If they ever decided to betray him, they were all in danger. He viewed it as a complete sickness. So, they would hold one another accountable from now on, or the Emperor would obliterate them, even the loyal. But despite the precarious position of the 12 leaders of the Empire, a seat on the Dark Council remained the ultimate honor a Sith could achieve in this era. By the time of the Great Galactic War in the year 3681 BBY, a position on the Dark Council was the greatest place of honor, power, and influence in the entire Sith Empire. Many Sith spent their entire lives plotting their ascension to the Council. But with millions vying for only 12 available seats, the competition was cutthroat to say the absolute least. Even the powerful and cunning, the few who managed to join the council often served for only a few months at a time. Their lives were usually cut short by internal council member struggles, backstabbing, or even external enemies who sought to take their place. But having a seat on the council did not mean that it was a luxury. Each one had a specific job that their position was fashioned over. They were called the 12 spheres of influence of the Sith, which were essentially domains or departments that the members of the council oversaw. While generally separate, the spheres occasionally overlapped with one another, sparking disagreement and conflict between Sith who refused to cooperate. But ultimately, each Dark Council member is responsible for ensuring the success of their own sphere. Today we won't be going too deeply into the council members in this video, since we're mainly focusing on the functions, duty, and history of the council. But if each of the members of the council interest you, then be sure to let us know if you would like to see that video. Moving on though, in the year 3653 BBY, the Great Galactic War concluded with the sacking of Coruscant. This ultimately led to the Sith Empire calling for a ceasefire. They held Coruscant hostage and would force the Republic to sign the Treaty of Coruscant, a lopsided agreement that gave the Sith Empire control of nearly half of the entire galaxy. What ensured in the next era was an 11-year-long period known as the Cold War. Here, various border skirmishes and proxy wars would erupt between the Republic and the Empire. The Jedi spent this era rallying their ranks after their temple was destroyed, and to gain back their strength in the Force, and resolved to fight. The Sith, on the other hand, plotted their next steps for when the war inevitably resumed, and the Dark Council each managed their own sphere of influence, readying it for a new era of war. But again, the Dark Council plotted against the Emperor, using this time of relative peace to prepare their board. But what about their individual duties? The sphere of defense of the Empire was the first. This focused on protection through eradicating threats within and outside Imperial borders. The defense sphere was heavily involved with the military and the strategy spheres, with all 3 joining control to the Ministry of War and the Imperial military. The defense of the Empire was perpetually headed by the Sith Lord Darth Mar, the most senior member of the entire 12 Council. Darth Marr is a fascinating Sith Lord. He was unique, as he believed that the infighting and political games played by his peers were just as destructive to the Empire as the Republic was. And so Darth Marr took it upon himself to command the Dark Council with intimidating authority and stern wisdom. Next, you have the sphere of military offense, as it was directed the allocation of aggression, firepower, and the deployment of the Imperial military for war. Its job was maximum efficiency. The department was the one that oversaw the conquest for the first Sith Empire's supremacy, and it was the department that changed heads most often. First, Darth Vengine oversaw the department and had created an elaborate plan to restart the Great War and consolidate total power so that the Sith would rise to the top. But more importantly, so that he could become Emperor. But he would be killed by his apprentice, Darth Baras. Darth Baras was a deceptive spy master who favored cunning and sabotage to destroy his enemies. By the conclusion of the Great War, he had connections both within the Republic and the Jedi. It was said that his servants had infiltrated every major rank in the Republic, and he would attempt to call himself the voice of the Emperor in order to make himself the de facto ruler of the Empire, thinking that Vitiate would not take notice. This, of course, though, resulted in his swift death. He was eventually succeeded by the Sith Lord known as Darth Aro. Darth Aro, though, would also have a short tenure, as he would be killed by his greatest rival, Darth Malgus. But Malgus would not claim control and dominance over this sphere. Instead, it was passed to the Sith Lord Darth Arcus, who would hold the seat for a very brief amount of time, when he betrayed the Empire when he took part in the Revanites' cult. Finally, the seat was taken by Darth Malgus directly at the conclusion of the Cold War. Next, you have the sphere of military strategy, which of course is battle tactics, invasion, and the Imperial Conquest Consolidation Corps. This sphere was responsible for the strategies and plans which allowed the military offense and defense of the Empire to achieve total victory. In the Great War, it was led by the Sith by the name of Darth Azamin, but he would be killed by Darth Decimus, who organized a Jedi strike team to infiltrate his stronghold. Decimus ascended to the seat and orchestrated the invasion of Corellia during the renewed war with the Republic. His occupation of Corellia was nearly perfect, only to be foiled by the unexpected formation of a resistance by Corellian locals. Next, you have the sphere of Imperial intelligence. This oversees all gathering and dispersal of information within the Empire, as well as the management of its vast spy network. It also manages the many divisions of the Ministry of Intelligence and was helmed by Darth Jadis. He was a Sith Lord shrouded in deep mystery, but he was recognized by his peers as brilliant, powerful, and enigmatic. No living being had seen his face beneath his mask, and all records of him previously being on the Dark Council had been wiped from all Imperial databases. A rumor persists, though, that the Sith Emperor himself declared that Jadis was second to him in power. However, this claim is called into question by the power feats of Darth Marr, who was also said to be second to none but the Emperor, as well as Malgus. And next we have the sphere of ancient knowledge. This was the sphere charged with discovery, preservation, and the deciphering of ancient Sith teachings and languages. They seek to strengthen the Empire, tapping into power buried in the past, where all the legendary Sith Lords and kings would reside. Darth Thanaton was the one who would lead this sphere. He was in charge of the Imperial Reclamation Service to excavate Sith artifacts from both the good of the Empire and the good of himself. Thanaton was a proud Sith traditionalist and fought long and hard for a seat on the council. He always found ways of doing away with the up-and-coming Sith Lords that would challenge him, promising to make them his apprentice before tricking them with excavation missions, sending them to die in spirit-infested tombs, ripped apart by the undead. Thanaton would even attempt the same strategy against Darth Nox, only for this to backfire. Nox would then take his place on the council towards the end of the Cold War. The sphere of production and logistics was responsible for the industries, economy, slave labor, and logistical support to the massive imperial civilization that was developed by Vitiate. The sphere dealt with the more practical running of the Empire's society. The Ministry of Logistics also reported to this sphere as well. Controlling this was Darth Voron, a pure-blooded Sith who earned respect by holding his position for many decades on the council. He was described as sophisticated and charming, utilizing his quick wit to severe implications in often contentious meetings of the Dark Council. Next is the sphere of expansion and diplomacy. It's exactly what it sounds like. They oversee the expansion of Imperial borders and the Imperial Diplomatic Service. It's almost oxymoronic for the Sith Empire to have any sort of diplomacy, which is why it was usually leaned more towards the expansion side of things. things and not diplomacy innately. This was overseen by Darth Ravage, who concentrated his efforts on conquest that served his own interests rather than those of a greater empire. Next is the sphere of laws and justice, the group that imposed law and order on the empire, punishing harshly any trace of defiance and instilling pride and respect in its citizens. They ensured that rigid order and efficiency was maintained and justice was served. Darth Mortis was the leader of this sphere. He held a balanced view, one that stated that the Empire's traditions and values were important, but relying too much on the past could compromise the future. This Sith also saw that the Treaty of Coruscant was upheld by the Republic. Next, you have the sphere of biotic science, which was concerned with the perfection and the destruction of the organic body. Cybernetic augmentation, catastrophic plagues, the medical needs of the Empire, the bioengineered abomination through Sith alchemy all fell under the oversight of this sphere. It was overseen by Darth Acheron, who obsessively augmented his own body with copious amounts of cybernetics. He was universally despised by the Imperial military for his extremely cruel views on failure and sycophants. He often would kill his soldiers who failed him in any way, and disdained subordinates who attempted to gain favor, treating them with the same disgust that he did the incompetents. Basically, he hated you no matter what. Next is the sphere of technology. These oversee the creation of new gadgetry, superweapons, and cybernetics. Darth Mekhis presided over this sphere and constructed the Sunraiser installation. The Sunraiser was a giant space station that had the sole purpose of producing superweapons. This position also changed hands several times in the Dark Council's history. After being killed by a Jedi, Mekhis would be succeeded by Darth Hadra, who was killed at Corellia by the Republic. The fallen Jedi Darth Carrot would ascend to the seat for a very brief period of time on the Council, before she too was bitterly killed in battle. Darth Asina was the final usurper of this position. Then you have the sphere of Sith philosophy. They upheld the Sith Code, they spread anti-Jedi teachings, and enforced adherence to the dark side. Darth Aruk was the one who helmed this sphere, and he would be extremely busy attempting to eradicate the Revanite cult. They sought to dilute the Sith with heresy concerning Darth Revan's balanced approach to the Force, so he made it his personal goal to wipe out the so-called Light Sith from the Empire. And at last but not least, we have the Sphere of Mysteries, also known as the Keepers of Mysteries. As the name suggests, this sphere is shrouded in secrecy, and almost no one in the entire Empire or the Dark Council knows what work this sphere secretly conducts. However, they do not question its importance, as this is the one that the Emperor had a personal hand in. The only sphere. The only thing known for sure about the sphere is its controller, Darth Rictus. Publicly, the sphere was responsible for the protection of Imperial secrets and dangerous lore that was not to be shared with the greater Empire. Keepers would scour the galaxy in search of holocrons and other sensitive data to lock away. The sphere was also covertly responsible for the management of assassins and the removal of high-risk targets to the Empire. But this was the Dark Council, the 12 spheres of influence, and the members that controlled it during the highest point in the Sith Empire's history. It's interesting to actually observe the Sith Order function on a large scale, much like how the Jedi do. Of course, the Dark Council didn't just oversee the Sith themselves, but a whole government and a civilization. Unlike Sidious's rule, it wasn't just a galactic empire, this was literally a Sith empire. They were the ones on top, and they were going to ensure that everyone knew it. The purpose of the Dark Council was to use the wisdom and teachings of the dark side to run society the way the Sith envisioned that it should be run. They didn't feel a need to hide their cruelty. What the Sith did was far more simple. They dared anyone to question them when they made their final decision. As in the end, power was everything to the Sith. We believe that we have solved the mystery concerning the Rule of Two's most confusing and controversial Sith Lord, the Sith that we love, Darth Vectivus, the Sith that did no evil. This is one of the strangest figures in the Sith history, especially in the era of the Rule of Two. Darth Vectivus was first told to us by Lady Lumaya, who gave his tale to a young and an impressionable Jacen Solo. However, there were several things about Darth Vectivus that raised some flags with many people, the first of which being the obvious: how can a Sith Lord live and not do any evil? One that existed in the Rule of Two especially, where it was imperative to kill one's master. There were so many logical fallacies about the life of Darth Vectivus and his story. So much was called into question. Many believed that this was a complete lie, a story made up by Lumaya to tempt Jacen Solo into joining and drawing upon the dark side of the Force, telling him that there was an example of a Sith Lord out there that used the dark side without succumbing fully to its power and the whisper of evil. However, what we have learned is that Vectivus was indeed a real man. And what's even more shocking from what we've discovered is we believe that Lumaya was telling the truth about everything that the man was. The truth of it all lies with a single holocron left behind by Vectivus. Greetings, Acolytes, and welcome back to the Archives. In today's holocron, we are going to once again revisit the mystery of Darth Vectivus. But today we are going to be talking not just about the man, but how he was presented in the lore, the proof of his existence, and what the later Sith thought of this man. But first, we have experienced a terrible vision in the Force. Many who use our archives are not yet subscribed to our order, so if you've been enjoying the near daily Star Wars holocron uploads, reach out with the Force and crush that subscribe button. It is your destiny. We have foreseen it. The story of Vectivus is a strange one to say the least. We are told he was a man who became a Sith purely out of curiosity, that he got his start as a shrewd businessman originally. The being who would become Vectivus was a human male who had a large family and a close-knit circle of friends, two oddities for a Sith already. He was an intelligent entrepreneur who had a successful career in business. For his entire life, he was just a Joe normal, everyday guy, except for the fact that he was unknowingly Force sensitive. He lived as the administrator of the John X Mine 811B mining facility on an asteroid in deep space. This ore-heavy asteroid was labeled as the MZX32905, but both Vectivus and the later inhabitants would simply call it the Home. The asteroid belt known as the Home was near the planet of Bimiel in the Outer Rim. But what both the administrator and the mining employees did not know was that the Home was deeply infused with the dark side. A dark side nexus lay deep within the asteroid, which had been a result of an extinct ancient species native to the dark side itself, one that had constructed an ancient civilization there. Unfortunately, we don't know a lot about this ancient civilization in the lore, but we can go looking if you guys want a video. Soon, the energies of the dark side began to affect the sanity of the John X Mine employees. The Force sensitive among them began experiencing visions or displayed new powers in the Force. Some of them even began to behave like the ancient species that had once inhabited the asteroid, as if they had been possessed by spirits long dead. The administrator, who was also experiencing strange phenomena, decided to close his facility down and discreetly cover up the bizarre events. He had become fascinated by his new powers, and he believed that he could hear the very whispers of the mine itself. So he decided to plumb into the depths of the caverns below, to experiment more with his newfound abilities, where he could hear the power of the dark side most clearly. Eventually, the entire mining operation on the asteroid belt became less lucrative, and Vectivus was no longer interested in maintaining the business, so he carefully mismanaged things in order to run it closer and closer to the ground, to bring a closure to things. He didn't want others venturing to the asteroid, so he needed to make its failure legitimate, keep everything quiet. Once the business was done, the man ventured out into the galaxy in search of something greater than himself, the Sith. Unfortunately for us though, at this pivotal moment, the lore goes quiet. We are not told the details of what exactly he finds, but we do know that he does locate a Sith Master, soon inheriting the title of the Dark Lord and becoming officially Darth Vectivus. However, the established moral code of his former life as a business executive remained deeply engraved in the man. Adherence to both those ethical standards prevented him from succumbing to the stereotypical ways of the Sith. Violence, galactic ambition, and the eradication of the Jedi were of no consequence to Vectivus. His contention was to simply immerse himself in Sith lore, to study the galaxy. For Vectivus, his conquest would be that of knowledge and business pursuits. Years later, he would return to the Home and built a massive mansion in the heart of the asteroid's dark side potency. There, Vectivus continued his study in the dark side, pioneering an ability known as Force Phantom. Force Phantom was a strange ritual that was an act that created apparitions from the siphoned Force energy of another life form. What this entailed was searching out through the Force for a single being. A species or sentience level did not matter. One could choose a bantha if they were so inclined. This would be what is known as the anchor of the Phantom, something which roots it in reality. The practitioner then draws out the life essence of the creature. This does not kill the creature, it simply takes their astral form and morphs it into an apparition which is totally under the control of the Sith Master. These apparitions are mostly invisible to the naked eye, but they can be sensed by Force sensitives, as well as seen on infrared cameras and scans. They can take the form of whatever the Sith decides, and they serve whatever purpose is needed, whether that be servitude, delivery, communication, or even combat. The Sith doesn't even have to be present with them for them to do their work. A phantom can be projected across vast differences, but they become more difficult to control the farther away they are. The process of summoning one is incredibly taxing on the user, and requires a substantial amount of force reserve in order to do so, but they are very useful once they are summoned. There is nothing inherently evil about a Force Phantom, since the creature they are summoned from are not harmed during the process. However, they are harmed in their phantom form. At the time that this apparition is destroyed by any means, the physical creature that served as its anchor also dies as well, in the same manner in which the phantom is killed. So while the ability itself is not sinister in nature per se, it would be especially cruel if the apparitions were used for combat. But what's compelling is that it appears as if Darth Vectivus didn't use his Force Phantoms in combat ever, adding more to the idea that he was not evil inherently. Vectivus would go on to pursue more financial operations on the side of business, while he would study the dark side in his spare time. His wisdom gained from the Force and his Sith training aided him in his business endeavors a great deal. He would also go on to craft a holocron of his own, pouring his knowledge into it. Apparently, he did quite a bit for his studies, as he was able to summon hundreds of Force Phantoms at once with very little effort. Oddly, the one thing that is mentioned about his story is him never training an apprentice. We have to assume that he of course did train an apprentice successfully, otherwise the rule of two would not have continued. But that brings up yet another confusing thing about his story: his death. Instead of dying at the hands of his apprentice, which is proper, he perished of old age. We know that he died happily surrounded by his friends and family. At least, that's what Lumaya says happened to him. But with Vectivus's death, things are about to get very interesting and controversial. Many years down the road, Lumaya made her secret base on the home, the asteroid. This is where she would tell the story to Jacen Solo. The way it was presented to us is that Lumaya is attempting to convince the good-natured Jacen that using the dark side is possible without succumbing to depravity of Vader or Sidious, becoming like his family. However, Lumaya and Vergir, who he both work with, were pathological liars. These two dark side Sith hopefuls would say anything to get Jacen to join their ranks. For Vergir especially, it is said that for her, truth and lies were both a means to an end. Lumaya was much in the same way. She played with facts to get what she needed. Much like Palpatine manipulating Anakin with the story of Darth Plagueis, it is possible that Lumaya only gave half-truths about Darth Vectivus and his life, making it appear as if the dark side was not as treacherous as Luke and other Jedi made it out to be. For a very long time, it was assumed that Vectivus was completely made up, a fabrication by Lumaya. Many Sith believed the existence of Vectivus to be impossible, many fans as well. But interestingly, we do not only have evidence that Darth Vectivus was real, but that he may have been everything that Lumaya claimed that he was. This all comes down to both his holocron and how he was remembered by the Sith that followed. The latter members of the Rule of Two absolutely despised Vectivus to the point of believing that he was a fake Sith, an imposter. Vectivus did nothing to further the goals of the Sith, and he left behind a legacy of mediocrity. In fact, they hated him so much that they treated his holocron as a piece of garbage. This was because he had mainly used his holocron as an accounting PC to keep track of all of his figures, using it to keep track of his finances. The knowledge contained was accounting logs, business ledgers, and advice and philosophy on business. One such entry said this: "Never borrow money from someone powerful enough to make you pay. Let your workers know you trust them, then watch them." However, the one reason they did not destroy the holocron of Vectivus was because it contained one piece of knowledge that all Sith wanted: the Force Phantom technique. This was the only worthwhile dark side information that the holocron contained. But the holocron of Vectivus was lost for centuries due to the madness of another Sith Lord, Darth Gravid. For a very long time, the Rule of Two searched for the holocron of Vectivus, hoping to get their hands on this single ability. In the year 40 ABY, the cult of the One Sith were discreetly growing in power on Korriban under Darth Krayt, and they got their hands on the holocron of Vectivus and learned the power of the Force Phantom. As a group, they decided to have it delivered to Darth Plagueis as an insult. The gift was to show what his worth to the Sith Order really was. The one Sith had found Darth Plagueis to be worthless, expendable. The treatment of Vectivus's legacy indicates that his status as a benevolent Sith may in fact be true, at least to some extent. There is even suggestions that Lumaya wasn't actually lying to Jacen, but deeply desired to have a Sith Lord rule the galaxy with the same moral compass as Darth Vectivus, believing that Jacen was a good candidate. Nevertheless, there are many things that don't add up about the life of Vectivus, and its entire legitimacy is questionable. The first is first. It's very difficult to accept that Vectivus did not kill his master. This is the most important step in the Banite Sith's life. This is what makes them worthy of taking the mantle. And not only this, but it's also impossible for Vectivus's master to not have died. If Vectivus did not kill him, then he would have considered him unworthy and would have trained a new apprentice, and that apprentice would be remembered in the line of the Rule of Two. But Darth Vectivus is the one who continued the Banite lineage directly, not someone else, so he did inherit the title, and his master is dead. But we do have a few theories. The first one is that we have to stretch the definition of doing no evil. From a certain point of view, vanquishing a Sith Lord may not be considered evil since they themselves are evil. Of course though, an apprentice slaying their master is not a righteous act. They do not have righteous intentions in doing this. However, the definition of doing no evil could be referencing the fact that Vectivus never pursued dominion, nor violence from the rest of the galaxy, and never pursued any sort of conquest from that point forward. Perhaps the story isn't implying that he was as pure as the driven snow, but that he was simply not interested in committing the atrocities native to other Sith. So the first possibility is that he did kill his master, but that it was not accredited to him as an evil act. The second theory is that he inherited the title by a technicality. This one requires us to use our imagination a little bit. Perhaps the Sith Master that Vectivus found was incredibly old or dying. It's a possibility that this had been a failure of the Sith, who had never found a suitable apprentice before. So when Vectivus arrived, the Master took the first opportunity that presented itself. He poured all of his knowledge into his new apprentice, just so that the Banite lineage could continue. In the moment of Vectivus's training, and the second that it was complete, the Master died due to this illness, leaving behind the businessman, the new Dark Lord of the Sith, by technicality alone, not by what he had proven himself worthy of, while still maintaining that he did no evil by not slaying his master. But again, this has not been confirmed at all, and is simply our own headcanon. We can't exactly take this as a firm conclusion though. And then there is the matter of Vectivus's apprentice. This being is not mentioned at all in the life of Vectivus, but it's someone who would have existed. Vectivus's peaceful death is a part of Lumaya's story that I personally believe to be the most likely lie. But it is possible that his apprentice did not kill him, which would give rise to another controversial Sith. You see, in the timeline of the Rule of Two, the next known Sith that follows Vectivus is Darth Gravid, though not directly. While we unfortunately don't have the actual dates that these two Sith Lords lived, it's quite possible that Gravid could have been Vectivus's apprentice, even though it's never specified. If this were true, it would also answer another great mystery of the Rule of Two Sith. As a quick recap, Gravid was a Sith Lord who became obsessed with Jedi lore, to the point where he went insane from trying to mix and merge Sith and Jedi ideologies and teachings. In the end, Gravid believed that he had to rebuild the Sith from the ground up, so he began to either destroy or hide away the collection of Sith knowledge that the Rule of Two had accumulated. He was stopped eventually by his apprentice, Darth Jean, but by the time that she defeated and killed him, he had already burned or lost a great deal of Sith books, scrolls, and holocrons. Among these was confirmed to be the holocron of Darth Vectivus. Now the reason this is a huge connection is because it would answer why Darth Gravid became so obsessed with Jedi tradition and lore. If his own master was the Sith that did no evil, and Vectivus never killed the one who trained him, then Gravid would not have had the proper Sith way demonstrated to him at all. If he didn't kill Vectivus, he would have earned the title of the Dark Lord illegitimately, and would never have taken that important step in Sithhood. In the Plagueis novel, we learn that killing one's master is not just ceremonially important to the Sith, but it's ritualistically important to the dark side. When Palpatine kills Darth Plagueis, it is said that he is anointed by the dark side. This is to say that he has been chosen to be the next Dark Lord, granted distinct power boosts because of it. the dark side energies of the universe focused into his one vessel, instantly granting Palpatine maddening levels of power. It is also said that he was enlightened to a higher state of mind, as he fully understood his mission as a Dark Lord. This is why it is said that Darth Plagueis was more powerful than Palpatine before Palpatine actually killed him. After the ritual was complete, Sidious's level of power grew astronomically, as the dark side itself had elected and chosen him. But if Gravid never had this moment because Vectivus died of old age, then he wouldn't be fully in tune with the rule of two. This fact, coupled with him having nothing but honest business practice, demonstrated Vectivus would lead him into becoming fascinated by the altruistic and compassionate ways of the Jedi, something he unknowingly instilled within his own apprentice. We plan on talking more about Gravid in another video, but these are our thoughts that connect him with Vectivus, and perhaps a reason why the later Sith absolutely despised him. Vectivus would have trained the Sith who set their order back for hundreds of years. There is a fortress buried beneath centuries of silence, not destroyed in war, not scorched by the light of a Jedi blade, but undone from within. Its halls, once adorned with Sith sigils, now lie cold and hollow, the stone charred and fractured by fire. It is a tomb, not of bodies, but of knowledge. No Jedi ever breached its gates, and no Sith dared to ever return, because what occurred within was not a collapse, but it was a purge, an execution of legacy, a self-inflicted wound that would bleed through centuries of Sith history. And at the heart of it stood a man calling himself Darth Gravid. Darth Gravid was a Sith Lord, a scholar, a heretic, and he nearly destroyed the very order that he swore to perfect. He called his doctrine the unifying path, a vision so radical, so blasphemous, that it drove him to destroy countless holocrons, artifacts, and rituals, not in rage, not in madness alone, but rather in faith. Gravid believed that the dark side was incomplete, that the Sith and their obsession with control and domination had lost everything vital to them, and he sought to fill that void with the very thing that they had sworn to oppose, with the light. What he attempted was not corruption, it was synthesis, an impossible reconciliation of opposites, a new vision of power through balance, and in doing that, he brought the Sith to the edge of extinction. Darth Gravid lived around 533 BBY, nearly 3 centuries after Darth Bane first established the Rule of Two. By this point in the history of the Sith, the Baneite lineage had solidified into something cold and methodical, a hidden war of succession, where knowledge was hoarded, power was passed down like a blade, and survival meant everything. But Darth Gravid was different. Where others sought strength through cruelty, he saw understanding. Where others sharpened their hatred, he studied. He was not the product of wrath, he was the product of doubt. He immersed himself in Jedi texts, not as an enemy, but rather as a student. He questioned the foundations of the dark side, and slowly, obsessively, he began to craft a brand new philosophy. He named it the Unifying Path. It was not simply a blending of Jedi and Sith teachings. This was something far more dangerous, the belief that true power came from embracing both light and dark, compassion and passion, restraint and fury, serenity and ambition. Gravid envisioned an order that could transcend the dichotomy of the Force, but the Force does not reward contradiction, it punishes. To walk between the light and the dark is to stand on the blade's edge, but cut from both sides. As Gravid delved deeper into his vision, his connection to the Force began to fracture. The dark side, sensing his hesitation, recoiled from him. The light, sensing his corruption, refused him. In reaching for balance, he became imbalanced. His meditations turned to obsession. His thoughts spiraled into fragmentation. His identity snapped. And worst of all, he began to lose his faith in the very foundation of the Sith tradition. In secret, he constructed a bastion. There he hoarded the greatest repository of Sith knowledge seen since the fall of the Old Republic. Rituals from the Golden Age, doctrines of alchemy, forbidden techniques scrawled in the margins of holocrons passed down from the Dark Lords of old. And at the center of it all, he guarded one power above all others: essence transfer. It was the lost ritual. Essence transfer was the closest thing the Sith had come to immortality, a technique that allowed a dark side spirit to leap from one body to another, defying death through sheer will. It was first discovered in the ancient era by Darth Endedu, later mastered by Vitiate, and obsessively pursued by Darth Bane in his final days. But Gravid may have perfected it. Some believe he uncovered fragments of Endedu's original teachings, pieces that Bane never found, and that Palpatine would spend a lifetime trying to recover. If the stories are true, then Gravid held in his hands the last complete pathway to Sith immortality, and then he destroyed it. The ritual of essence transfer was not lost to time, it was lost to flame. In Gravid's efforts to purify the Sith, he consigned their greatest secret to oblivion. Sidious centuries later would clone body after body in a desperate attempt to reconstruct what had already been burned by the hands of a man who believed that he was saving the Sith. As his obsession deepened, Gravid sealed himself within his stronghold. He raised force barriers around his bastion, isolating himself from the galaxy and from the Sith Order itself. Within those walls, he began the Purge. One by one, holocrons were shattered, scrolls reduced to cinders, relics consigned to fire. The knowledge of worlds, the legacy of empires, gone. And then came another, Darth Jean, his apprentice, his shadow. She had not been taught these deep rituals. Gravid in his spiral withheld them, believing she too may be corrupted by the path that he had already begun to transcend. But Jean was no acolyte. She was trained in pain, raised in the crucible of the Rule of Two, and what she found behind those barriers was not enlightenment, it was betrayal. A Sith Lord who had turned his blade inward. A master who had destroyed their inheritance, a heretic burning the legacy of Bane to ashes, all in a pursuit of doctrine that had never belonged in the darkness. And so she did what a true Sith apprentice must. She challenged him. She breached the barriers. Darth Jean, the apprentice raised in the shadows of the Rule of Two, carved her way through the outer defenses of the bastion with fury and purpose. The fortress had once been a sanctum of power. Now it reeked of smoke, scorched parchment, and ritual fire. The air inside was thick with ash. The walls wept heat from weeks of quiet destruction. She moved through now a graveyard of power and of the inheritance that she deserved, her history. The holocrons were gone, shattered, burned. The scrolls unspooled into flame. Relics of unspeakable potency smashed against the stone. What had once been the most complete collection of Sith knowledge since the fall of the ancient empire had now all been reduced to a funeral pyre. At the center of it all stood her master. Darth Gravid turned slowly to face her. His robes tattered, his face pale, hollow. He was not armed, not in the traditional sense. His lightsaber hung at his waist, untouched. His eyes did not burn with hatred or fear. They burned with certainty. "I knew you would come," he said, "and I hoped. I prayed that you would see what I have seen." Darth Jean did not speak. She did not need to. Her silence was a blade, her stance, her verdict. "The Sith are broken," Gravid whispered. "We build legacies of pain only to see them crumble in fire and betrayal. The Jedi, they fear emotion. We worship it. Both are incomplete. But together we could become something more." He gestured to the flames around him, to the blackened remains of the Sith power centuries old. "I destroyed this to make space for the future." Jean stepped forward. "You destroyed everything." And that is when the duel began. Gravid ignited his lightsaber first, not out of aggression but necessity. His style was like anything Jean had ever faced before. He moved like a man unbound from fear, casting aside the rigid ferocity of the Sith lightsaber combat for something slower, more fluid. An echo of Form 6, almost meditative. But behind that grace was power, terrifying, overwhelming power. Even fractured in spirit, even isolated from the full strength of the Force, Darth Gravid fought with the fury of someone who had trained alone in silence, sharpening himself not for survival, but for revelation. Jean, by contrast, fought with the raw, unfiltered brutality of the Baneite lineage. There was no elegance, there was no restraint. Her blow struck hard, fast, and with lethal intention. She wasn't trying to teach her master a lesson, she was trying to kill him. Sparks lit the chamber like flashes of memory, each one illuminating the ruins of a history lost forever. They fought atop the ashes of Endedu's rituals, between the cinders of Sith alchemy, near the hollow plinth where the last essence transfer scroll had turned to smoke. But still Gravid endured. "You still do not see it," he hissed. "We could be more than Sith. We could be whole." But even as he spoke, his movements grew erratic. His footwork staggered. The fractures in his ideology were manifesting in his combat. hesitation clashing with instinct, serenity interrupting rage. He struck with a Jedi's precision one moment and a Sith savagery the next. He was slowly becoming nothing. The turning point came not with a strike, but with a severing. Gravid landed a clean blow, arcing his lightsaber across Jean's left side in a vicious vertical slash. The blade bit deep, searing through her shoulder, arm, face, and chest. Flesh burned, blood hissed. Her scream echoed off the stone. She fell to her knees, unarmed, mutilated, broken. But she did not yield. There was no plea, no retreat, no surrender. "You destroyed the Sith," she rasped. "Now I will destroy you." And with that she rose. No lightsaber, no tactic, purpose. Jean threw herself forward, disarming Gravid with a burst of raw, violent power. Her pain had become a weapon, her fury unrestrained. She struck him with no elegance but with desperation, with grief, and with betrayal. And in the end, Darth Jean killed him, not with the lightsaber, but with her hands. Gravid collapsed to the floor, eyes wide, not in fear, but in recognition. "You understand now," was the last thing he ever said. His apprentice did not answer. Jean stood over his body, her own ruined, her skin scorched, one arm hanging in shreds, but still she stood. In this moment, Darth Jean was not a victim, she was not a survivor, she was Sith. That was not a victory born of strength, it was born of sacrifice. Gravid, even with his broken connection, had nearly destroyed her. Had he embraced the dark side fully, he may have annihilated her without effort. Had he surrendered to the light, he may have become one of the wisest Jedi Masters of his age. But he chose neither, and the Force had abandoned him. His failure proved a truth older than the rule of two. The Sith cannot be balanced. They exist in opposition to the natural order. The dark side thrives in distortion, in extremes. The Jedi flow with that current though. The Sith attempt to twist it. To reach for both is to drown. The legacy left behind from this duel cannot be overstated. I would even go as far as to call it the greatest duel of the rule of two. With Gravid's death came the loss of untold power. The technique of essence transfer, known, studied, perhaps perfected, vanished in flame. What Bane had chased, what Sidious would later dedicate his entire life to reclaiming, was destroyed in a single generation. The rituals of mass sacrifice, the secrets of the Sith spirit binding, the ancient alchemy of the Golden Age, the voices of the Dark Lords who spoke through talismans and holocrons, all of them gone. And Darth Jean, the woman who preserved the rule of two, would carry her scars forever. Some say she replaced her lost limbs and organs with Sith technology, augmenting herself until pain became power. Others say she lived out only to train a successor, and then died of her injuries. Darth Plagueis believed the latter. But one thing is certain, without Darth Jean, the Sith would have died at that fortress. Without her pain, there would be no Darth Sidious, no Vader, no Empire. She was the hidden pillar of the Sith's future, a mutilated sentinel standing in the ashes of the past. The fortress fell silent. Its walls, once brimming with the echoes of power, stood hollow. The holocrons were gone. The scrolls were smoke. The ancient tongues that once whispered through the halls no longer spoke. Darth Gravid was dead. Darth Jean, scarred, broken, but victorious, emerged from the ruins not as a survivor, not as a conqueror, but as a vessel for pain, for survival, and for the rule of two. But what she preserved came at the cost of the Sith would never fully recover, because Gravid didn't just die in that fortress, he took nearly everything with him. The Sith have always been defined by their relationship with power, not only in its pursuit, but in how they preserve it, through their rituals, their relics, sorcery, and alchemy. Knowledge to the Sith is as sacred as dominance. Without it, there is no ascension, no legacy, no continuity. And yet Gravid deliberately, methodically erased centuries of that legacy. Among the rituals destroyed in this purge were some of the darkest, most potent, and most elusive powers that the Sith ever uncovered. Let's break down exactly what was lost and the consequences of it. Obviously, essence transfer, the apex of immortality for the Sith. First discovered by Darth Endedu, essence transfer allowed the Sith to project their consciousness into a new host, bypassing death entirely through sheer strength of will. It was more than survival, it was actual continuity, a means by which a Sith could live through generations, expanding their empires across lifetimes. Bane pursued the technique obsessively, attempting to transfer his spirit into his apprentice Zana. Vitiate, known later as Valkorion, many believe perfected it. He didn't just use it, he thrived on it. Leaping from body to body across centuries, Vitiate ruled over multiple empires in multiple identities. Through essence transfer, he essentially became a god. Sidious generations later would attempt to reclaim this lost art. He would pour vast resources into cloning, into body preservation, into Sith artifacts and hidden vaults, searching for a ritual that Gravid had already possessed. It was said that Gravid had accessed teachings from Endedu's own lineage, hints, fragments, perhaps even the full ritual itself. Not theory, not legend, practice, and that he destroyed it. Look at it like this. What Palpatine would spend a lifetime failing to reconstruct, Darth Gravid erased in an instant. This act alone made him one of the greatest failures in Sith history. But he didn't just stop there. The rituals of mass sacrifice came next. The ancient Sith were practitioners of large-scale sacrificial rituals, ceremonies that drained the life force of entire populations to fuel apocalyptic powers. Lords like Naga Sadow, Exar Kun, and Vitiate wielded these rituals without hesitation. These were not battlefield techniques, they were planetary incantations, designed to ravage worlds, summon entities, and empower a single Sith beyond comprehension. By the time of Bane, these practices had already faded from memory. But Gravid in his studies had reconstructed what many believed to be portions of it, recovered fragments from the holocrons of Sadow and Ragnos, rituals that drew a collective suffering, turning death into fuel. Those too were thrown to the fire. He also destroyed spirit anchoring and Sith object binding. One of the hallmarks of the ancient Sith Lords was their ability to anchor their spirits to objects, holocrons, tombs, and talismans. This form of pseudo-immortality allowed their consciousness to endure even after death. Karnus Mur, Zozan, and Endedu each demonstrated variations of this technique, binding their essence to artifacts that would haunt generations to come. But in the era of the Rule of Two, these powers are conspicuously absent. We see no true spirit-bound Sith, no essence-possessed objects, no haunted temples speaking with the voices of the dead. It's not because the rituals were myth, it's because Gravid destroyed it. Then he also destroyed alchemy and transmutation. The ancient Sith could warp biology, they could twist flesh, shaping beasts, creating monstrous Sith spawn through using darkside science and force incantation. The likes of Sadow, Kun, and Ragnos wielded these arts with terrifying ease. And while it's true traces of alchemy survived in the later eras, most notably in Darth Plagueis and Darth Sidious's experiments, true Sith alchemy was never again seen at the scale practiced in the Old Empire. Gravid had restored pieces of it, and then he incinerated it. We learned that before he destroyed it all, he was essentially a great collector of this knowledge, a completionist in many ways. And this is where I think the story gets really haunting. Because Darth Sidious, often viewed as the culmination of the Rule of Two, was in many ways a restorationist. He was a scavenger, a Sith whose power was immense, and all of it was spent rebuilding what had already been lost. Sidious's obsession with temples, his relentless pursuit of ancient holocrons, his creation of clones, vessels, and Sith libraries, all of it stems from a single truth. Palpatine did not inherit a complete legacy. He inherited the ruins left behind by Gravid. Everything that Sidious did, every experiment, every corrupted artifact, every darkside excavation, was an attempt to reclaim what should have been passed down naturally. Instead, he built an empire on fragments, on echoes, and even with all of his power, he never found what Gravid had destroyed. This is why so many fans, and even characters in the lore itself, believe that the ancient Sith were more powerful than their successors. It's not just mythologizing, it's reality. The ancient Sith wielded knowledge that allowed them to reshape life, defy death, to dominate through presence alone. Their power wasn't in lightsaber techniques or clever manipulation, it was in ritual mastery, in domination over the Force. The Rule of Two, by contrast, became more refined, but less esoteric, more focused, but less cosmic. They were clever, dangerous, and efficient, but they no longer played with the same metaphysical fire, because that fire had been put out by their own. There is only one figure in Sith history who mirrors Gravid's descent. That's Darth Traya. Like Gravid, Traya saw the Force as a prison. She questioned the binary between Jedi and Sith, believing that both were flawed reflections of a greater truth. She had also descended into heresy, abandoning dogma in pursuit of philosophical freedoms. But where Traya turned her hatred towards the Force itself, Gravid sought reconciliation with it. He didn't hate the Jedi, he didn't despise the Sith. He desired to unify them. He genuinely believed that serenity and passion could coexist, that empathy could enhance power, that balance was not the enemy, but the final form of mastery. And in trying to hold both visions in his hands, he shattered. Traya saw futility in the Force, Gravid saw potential, but both stood in defiance of what the Force really is, which is uncompromising. Gravid's mind broke because he tried to resolve contradiction with belief. He walked a path no one had successfully walked before, not because it couldn't be conceived, but because it could never survive. This is the final tragedy. Darth Gravid, for all of his heresy, was brilliant. Even in spiritual collapse, he wielded power that nearly killed his apprentice. Had he embraced the dark side without hesitation, he may have become one of the greatest Sith Lords of the Rule of Two. Had he embraced the light, he may have stood among the wisest Jedi of his era. But instead he chose to walk between, and the Force abandoned him for it. The unifying path is an inevitable one, because for every Sith who seeks to dominate, there will come one who seeks to understand, who questions the pain, who seeks another path. But the dark side does not evolve. The dark side devours, and in trying to save the Sith, Gravid nearly destroyed them. Darth Gravid's name is rarely spoken, his memory is buried, his legacy scrubbed from history, reduced to whispers, but his impact endures, because long after his bones have turned to dust, the Sith have still paid the price for his visions. And if you ever wonder why Sidious feared death so deeply, why he hoarded knowledge like a starving man, why he never truly trusted his own creations, it's because deep down, he was always chasing the ghost of Darth Gravid. What was once the beating heart of the entirety of the Sith Order, Korriban stood as a graveyard of kings, a crucible of power, and the birthplace of all that was dark and evil. Its name alone once inspired fear and reverence in the Sith culture, but as centuries wore on and empires rose and fell, the significance of Korriban slowly would fade into myth and legend. Its power was greatly diminished, as was its importance to the overall order, and by the time of the Rule of Two era, the Sith practically disregarded the planet altogether. Plagueis discouraged Sidious from ever bothering with it in the first place, and as far as we know, Sidious hardly even mentioned it to his own apprentice. Darth Vader never even set foot on the ancestral home of the Sith. So what happened? Why did the birthplace of the Sith Order become a dusty, forgotten relic? Well, my friends, that's what we aim to explore in today's holocron. Dusty forgotten relics are our speciality. They contain secrets yet to be discovered, but we would be remiss if you too were to miss out on many of these secrets to be uncovered in the future. So if you haven't already, reach out with the Force and crush that subscribe button, allowing yourself to claim the hidden knowledge of the Sith. Now, my friend, let's begin. When the 12 Dark Jedi first arrived on Korriban in 6900 BBY, Sources Sin described the world as the world that screams the loudest for those who can hear the dark side's voice. There was no more apt description for the world than this. From the rituals of the ancient Sith kings, Korriban became a pure nexus of the dark side of the Force. The very people that it birthed were innately connected to the energies of darkness. Their entire culture surrounded war, dominion, survival. All of this was taught to them by the unforgiving sands of their cruel home. The Dark Jedi would emulate this lifestyle, learning all the secrets of the Sith Kings from the Valley of the Dark Lords. This was a great resting place, a valley of tombs containing the remains and knowledge of the previous kings of Korriban. And as the generations of the Sith wore on, more Dark Lords would rise and fall, and each one was buried in their own tomb on Korriban. A graveyard world. Ironically, with every death of every Dark Lord, the world would grow in power. Their evil influence added to the surging energies of darkness that swirled beneath the crust of the planet. Endless tales of Sith spirits wandering desolate tombs have been told. These malevolent entities continued to pour their hatred, their selfishness into everything around them. Most of them were buried with the objects that they created in life. Artifacts, holocrons, scrolls, those that contain unimaginable potency in the darkness. And for thousands of years, Korriban would use these energies to stand as a beacon within wild space for those that belonged to the dark side, for those that called themselves Sith. But Darth Sidious would later annotate that quote by Sorza Sin that we read. In Sidious's own words, he would write this: Korriban lost potency over the past 7,000 years, but it still whispers of darker secrets. This is indeed very true. Much of Korriban's power was lost due to the raids of the Jedi. In the year 5000 BBY, Naga Sadow failed to eradicate the Republic during the Great Hyperspace War conflict, marking a devastating loss in the Sith Empire's history. Instead, Sadow actually led the forces of the Republic and the Jedi right to the doorstep of the Sith homeworld. Once Naga's forces were defeated, and he fled into the unknown parts of space, the Republic took total control of Korriban. From this moment forward, they made it their mission to eradicate the dangerous teachings of the Sith, and Korriban was their first obvious stop. A purge would take place, but this time, it would be a purge of knowledge. The Jedi raided as many temples, tombs as they could in order to find and erase any legacy of the Sith. They didn't get it all though. The spirits of the Dark Lords long dead rejected the Agents of the Light, defiling their resting places, and they lashed out with vicious resolve. Soon though, the tombs of the Valley of the Dark Lords became extremely hazardous, especially for Jedi. And so the Jedi Order would decide to erase the location of Korriban within the archives, so that no being would ever attempt to visit the desolate graveyard. To make matters even worse for the Sith, the Jedi were basically totally successful. Their raids of the treasures of the dark side greatly diminished not only the power of the individual tombs, but of the entire planet. Korriban was now completely uninhabited. The wars that used to rage on it now fell completely silent. The Golden Age had crumbled. No more domination took place, no more rituals, no more hatred. What remained was a barren wasteland filled with bones and seething spirits. As the years dragged on though, many would end up visiting Korriban, and the Sith Order would repeatedly attempt to replenish the dark presence there. Exar Kun would visit the world, only to uncover a mystery and to find Naga Sadow's final resting place on Yavin 4. In 3996 BBY, Exar would establish a Sith Academy on Korriban under the watchful eye of a new headmaster, a Sith by the name of Jorak Uln. The Academy here would become a reoccurring thing for the next several thousand years, as the Sith thematically used the birthplace of their own order as the training ground for new recruits. Since the Order got its beginning on Korriban, each Sith would also begin there. The Sith Academy would exist for a surprising amount of time, mostly though due to the sheer negligence of the Jedi Order. The reason for this is the Jedi were severely weakened following their Great War with Exar Kun, and despite being aware of the Sith Academy and activity on Korriban, the Jedi openly chose not to attack it. They instead were foolish, and they deemed the Sith Order to be lost without proper leadership to take control, and so the Jedi overlooked the Academy's existence, thus allowing the Sith to grow and train unabated for the next 40 years. This would be when Revan and Malak would be the ones to bring Korriban back to prominence once they arrived and reclaimed the Sith homeworld. Revan and Malak had little interest in the birthplace of the Sith, but they were purely there because of one of the Rakatan star maps that led them directly to the Starforge, located on Korriban. In their pursuit of the map though, they would meet the current headmaster of the Sith Academy, a Sith by the name of Uthar Wynn. Seeing the two Sith as true Dark Lords and even the rightful successors to the Sith Empire, Wynn pledged fealty to them and began supplying the entirety of the Empire with Sith trainees trained on Korriban. Uthar and his Sith cared more about the sanctity of Korriban than Revan and Malak ever did though. After all, they were two former Jedi with larger aims than protecting the Sith legacy. For Revan and Malak, the Sith were merely a title to facilitate their own legacy, and the legacy that the Starforge would secure for them. Once Revan had been redeemed and Malak utterly defeated, the Academy basically crumbled. Without Jedi even having to do anything and never having to lift a hand against it, the remaining members of Korriban tore themselves apart, thus beginning an event known as the Sith Civil War. This event left Korriban a wasteland yet again, and during the days of the Sith Triumvirate, when Nihilus was active, there was a smaller academy that was still active on Korriban, but it was a shadow of what had come before. But the training process was altered. Only select assassins were brought from it, and they were trained by computer programs rather than real Sith masters due to a lack of proper teachers. The Sith were dying out. They too would eventually fizzle out once the Sith Triumvirate was defeated, and the Jedi once more took control of Korriban. This time though, they established a Republic space station above Korriban and a blockade around the world to ensure that the Sith would never reclaim it, or at least, not for a time. As the decades wore on, the world of the Sith grew quieter and quieter. It was still no place for a Jedi, as the Sith created war beasts such as the Tukado still roamed the world, and whispers and rumors of Sith spirits still permeated around the planet. Eventually though, the Sith once more attacked and took control of Korriban with the reconstituted Sith Empire. The Sith returned, ripping out of hyperspace to begin their blitzkrieg. Their first mission was to reclaim their home, an assault which was led by Darth Vindican and a very young Malgus. Vitiate, one of the original members of the Golden Era, had reclaimed his home. Under Vitiate's occupation, Korriban was rebuilt almost to its former glory. The Temple Pyramid was erected once more, and the Sith Academy was re-established. Many powerful Dark Lords, warriors, and Inquisitors rose from the ranks of those trained here, as the Sith teachers made use of Korriban's innately dangerous environment. This would be the true test of their students. They weren't above throwing them into the Sith spirits-infested temples, retrieving obituary items just to prove that they were worth their time. And along with training the next generation of Sith, the scholars of the Empire delved into the histories, the biological life forms that permeated the planet. There was still so much rich history to uncover during this era. However, it was mostly done out of pure tradition. The reconstituted Sith had great reverence for Korriban. However, they acknowledged that it was feeling a bit emptier than the legends had claimed. Dromund Kaas was now the capital and the center of power of the new Sith Empire though, no longer Korriban, and so most Sith Lords had their eyes on that world rather than the dunes of the desert planet. But following the final defeat of Vitiate, the Sith basically splintered, and in this process, Korriban's power dwindled even further, and now its raw power grew even quieter, nearly silent. And along with its silence, so too did the Sith's own allegiance to it. The Jedi continued to plunder the tombs even more, ridding the galaxy of as many Sith tomes and artifacts as they could locate, creating entire branches of Jedi government just to attack this one world. They even began removing bodies of ancient Sith Lords, doing everything possible to dissipate the energies of the dark side. And miraculously, my friends, it worked swimmingly. Thousands of years would go by, and now we reach the age of 1010 BBY, calling upon the War of Light and Darkness. The Brotherhood of Darkness would once again re-establish a training academy on Korriban, but this would be the final academy. Due to the significance of the planet, not just any old Sith Lord was ever permitted to train there. However, one Sith Lord that we know quite well would be permitted. The Sith's name was Darth Bane. But by this point, the dark side on Korriban was little more than a whisper. Bane had described it as a distant echo. The library in the academy held only a small fraction of the once vast Sith knowledge, and the students rarely, if ever, ventured into the library themselves. The only one with interest in the crumbling scrolls was Bane, who drew much inspiration from the tales of the old Dark Lords. It seemed as though the Brotherhood of Darkness had completely left behind all the ways of the old Sith, and so Bane determined to explore Korriban to find knowledge that the Brotherhood had overlooked, that the Jedi had overlooked. Bane would end up undertaking a quest into the Valley of the Dark Lords, not willing to accept that there was truly nothing left to find. Despite all of the warnings from his superiors though, Bane went anyway. His journey was harrowing, and despite nearly being eaten alive by piranha beetles and a pack of Tukada, he found himself absolutely nothing in return as a reward. No terrifying Sith apparition ready to curse him, no holocrons hiding in a secret chamber, no artifacts to grant him evil power. He just found dust and scraps of bones. It was a hard truth, but one that he would pass down to each of the members of the Rule of Two. Once the Brotherhood of Darkness fell, it was official. Korriban would no longer be a holding place for the Sith. However, it continued to have a great amount of meaning for them as their birthplace, but it no longer held power. And for those who were less sentimental, Korriban may as well have been as useful as a cemetery. But now let's jump further into the Rule of Two. When training Sidious, Plagueis would actively discourage his apprentice from believing that the Sith world such as Korriban held any sort of significance or reverence. One time Sidious attempted to ask his master why they didn't take field trips to those planets, and this is what Plagueis responded with. "You are impatient. You see no value in learning about weapons or explosives, force suggestion or healing arts. Your hunger for power of the sort you imagine is to be found on Korriban, Dromund Kaas, and Zygula. So allow me to tell you what you'll encounter in those reliquaries, Jedi treasure hunters, and legends. Of course there are tombs in the Valley of the Dark Lords, but they have been plundered, and now draw only tourists. insignificant beings. You see, this is why the Sith of the Rule of Two era abandoned Korriban. They imagined that all of its secrets had been completely plundered. Its power was now just a hushed whisper, and the only thing you would find there, as Plagueis mentioned, was dangerous Sith spirits. There was hardly a reason to ever go to Korriban, because it would not only be unfruitful, but it would be lethal. Plagueis would take a journey to the world purely out of curiosity once. He had intended to see if the Sith spirits were actually real, as he had read all about them, but in his scientific study, he had determined that such a phenomenon was impossible. He had wanted to see if it was possible for the Sith Lords to retain their awareness beyond death, for if that were possible, it may give him an avenue towards eternal life through science. But when he ventured to Korriban, he found it to be utterly disappointing. This is the account given to us by Plagueis. The tomb of Hakagam Grosh remains silent to my queries, and the throne where Sorza's Sin once sat contained no mocking, imperious specter. I was ready to conclude that the tales are merely diversions for the credulous, but as I boarded my ship into the Valley of the Dark Lords, I beheld a vision of the Sith Lord Marka Ragnos. The apparition challenged my claim to the Sith title, and railed against my plan to dismantle the traditions of Korriban. But the visions of Ragnos would not answer my questions, nor my delineated inquiries. He snarled and disappeared in a whirl of smoke. Is it possible that the entire episode simply played out completely in my mind? Plagueis is in complete denial. Sidious would annotate his text with his own story, and this is what Sidious would write. The spirits of Korriban are quite real. On one occasion, they nearly killed me. But I agree with my master in this observation. The dead Dark Lords are evasive in their speech, and are ultimately treacherous. On Korriban, one can only expect to find death lurking around every corner without any real reward. Sidious would only visit Korriban on a handful of occasions. The first time was the one that he mentioned, where he had demanded knowledge from the old spirits, angering them and causing them to attack him. His most faithful servant, though, would end up dragging him out of the tombs before the spirits could deal their final blow. The last time he ventured there, though, was right before his final death. Sidious sought the wisdoms of the spirits once more, because his cloned body was rapidly deteriorating, and the Sith had exhausted all other options. For all intents and purposes, the Rule of Two Sith were absolutely correct about Korriban. They would find absolutely nothing there to help them, and there was no use in sticking around if Korriban could not provide them with anything, especially not power. With all of that said, there is one more Sith in the lore that managed to squeeze out Korriban's final secret. Asherad Het would find what no others could manage, the holocron of Zozan. Zozan was one of the founders of the Sith, one of the original 12 Dark Jedi. Her spirit would actually personally train him in the ways of the Sith, transforming him into Darth Krayt. Upon his later return to Korriban, though, Krayt began the One Sith Empire, and he hid himself in stasis for many decades, hiding right under the nose of Luke Skywalker's Jedi Praxium. The Sith would grow on Korriban once more, reclaiming it for a final time in the lore, and so the sands of the Tomb World became the birthplace of the reborn Sith, the Rule of One. The Force has never meant one thing. To the Jedi it is harmony, a binding energy that surrounds, penetrates, and connects all living things. To the Sith it is domination, a well of power that rewards strength and punishes weakness. But even among these ancient orders, there have always been outliers. Those who don't merely use the Force, but those that reinterpret it. Those who see it not as an energy or a power or even a destiny, but as a philosophy. One of the most famous examples of this is Darth Traya, the exiled Jedi Master who came to see the Force itself as a malevolent god. She believed the Force was an uncaring manipulator, a will that used both Jedi and Sith alike as puppets in a cosmic game. To Traya, the Force was not to be served or obeyed, it was to be defied. But today, this is not the story of Darth Traya. This is about something far more disturbing. Another philosopher of the Force who didn't see the Force as a tyrant, but as something worse, a mirror. This is the story of Darth Ruin, a Jedi Master turned Sith cult leader who believed that only his mind could truly comprehend the Force. A man who thought that the galaxy, the Jedi, the Sith, and all other sentient life were simply wrong. A man who convinced 50 Jedi to abandon the Order with words alone, who walked among the ashes of the Sith Empire and resurrected that empire through belief, and who became so feared that his own followers turned on him, terrified he would consume them all in a ritual to ascend beyond mortality itself. This is not a story of war, a story of conquest, or a story of lightsaber duels. This is the story of what happens when someone is so certain in their own truth that they can make others believe it too. This is the story of Darth Ruin. Before he was Ruin, he was known as Phannius, a Jedi Master in the final century of the new Sith Wars, and even then he was dangerous. But he was dangerous not because of what he did, but because of how he thought. Phannius wasn't like other Jedi. He didn't challenge the code with emotion, or violate the rules of attachment. His heresy was more subtle, and far more insidious. Phannius believed that reality itself was subjective, and that truth, morality, even the Force were constructs to be bent around perception, and more specifically, his perception. Phannius began to argue that all sentient beings, Jedi, Sith, civilians, rulers, teachers, they were all incapable of understanding the Force, that their interpretations were childish, that their codes, their philosophies, their moralities were flawed lenses through which they distorted what the Force truly was. And only he, through his superior intellect, could see the Force clearly. This was not arrogance in the typical sense of the Sith, it was something worse. He embraced solipsism, the belief that the self is all that truly exists. Phannius didn't just believe he was more intelligent than the rest of the Jedi. He began to believe that only his consciousness was the real one, and that everyone else was just practicing in a collective illusion too primitive to understand. Because of this, the Jedi Council grew very uneasy. They attempted to contain his teachings, to debate him, to ignore him. Nothing worked. Because Phannius wasn't just some raving heretic. He was brilliant, charismatic, thoughtful, a master of argument and persuasion. He didn't shout down at his critics. He dismantled them slowly, publicly, and always with a smile. Eventually though, Phannius would depart the Jedi Order, not in exile, not in shame. He walked away because he believed the Order had nothing left to teach him, that no one did. And on that day that he left behind a message too. A message that would haunt Jedi historians for centuries. The Force shall free me. Not just us, not the Jedi, not the Sith, me. After his departure from the Jedi, Phannius disappeared from all official record, but he didn't go into hiding, not right away. He remained active in public discourse for some time, not as a Sith Lord, but as a rogue philosopher. He wrote, taught, and debated. He gave lectures in forgotten corners of the galaxy, and most dangerously, he listened. He listened to those that were disillusioned, angry, curious, and misunderstood. Over the course of months, perhaps even years, he began to draw many followers. Not fanatics, not warriors, but thinkers, idealists, students of the Force who, like him, felt suffocated by doctrine and tradition. And then something unprecedented happened. 50 Jedi left when he officially departed the Jedi Order and laid down his title. There were no battles, there was no bloodshed, it was only words. The Jedi that followed him not because they were promised power or wealth or revenge, but because he convinced them that they were already living a lie, that the Force is not what they had been taught that it was, that they could become part of something deeper, more true. This was not a seduction, it was ideological conversion. Phannius offered them meaning, a new understanding, a reason to believe that their doubts were not weakness, but rather that it was clarity. And once he had them, he vanished. The Jedi were left fractured, afraid. They had seen many embrace the dark side before, but none like this, never through pure ideology. Never through persuasion alone. Many historians would later compare his fall to that of Dooku, another charismatic Jedi who left the Order and influenced the galaxy with concepts bigger than violence. But even Dooku had relied on power, prestige, and even war. But Phannius didn't raise his saber at all. He raised a mirror, and he asked others if they liked what they saw. And it was after this that Phannius ceased to be, and Ruin was born. Darth Ruin. After orchestrating the defection of 50 Jedi, Darth Ruin disappeared into the stars, but his mission was far from over. But again, he was different. He didn't raise an army, he didn't declare war on the Republic. What he did was far more patient, far more terrifying. He went on a pilgrimage to the graves of the old Sith Empire. The galaxy, after nearly 1,000 years of Jedi dominance, had long since forgotten many of these places. Worlds like Ziost, Korriban, Thule, and Umbria, they had all become little more than ghost stories. The Sith were dead, their teachings were fractured, their followers reduced to cults, tribes, isolated warlords who clung to scraps of forgotten doctrine. And it was among these remnants that Darth Ruin preached. He didn't approach the lost Sith as a conqueror, he came as a prophet. He He told them that the Sith had failed not because they were weak, but because they were wrong, because they had misunderstood the Force, because they had corrupted themselves with obsession, tradition, and rivalry, and that Darth Ruin alone could lead them back. Some attempted to kill him, others knelt. Slowly though, tribe by tribe, Ruin began to rebuild the Sith. But it wasn't the Sith of old, it wasn't the Brotherhood of Darkness, or the legacy of Naga Sadow. This was something new. He offered them not just strength, but meaning, a grand unifying theory of the dark side. He promised them that they were not just survivors, that they were chosen, that they would become a part of something eternal, something that transcended war and death and weakness. And whether out of fear, awe, or belief, many followed. This is what made Ruin so deadly. He didn't just gather Force wielders, he converted them. He built a cult on power alone, but something greater. He built a cult on faith. In the shadows of dead empires, Ruin raised a new one, not built on fear, but on worship. He didn't just revive the Sith, he made himself the reason that they existed. By the time Darth Ruin had gathered and then scattered the tribes under one banner, Darth Ruin had achieved what no other Dark Lord had accomplished since the days of the Ancients. He had resurrected the Sith. But the vision he offered wasn't one of galactic conquest, not at first though. It wasn't about vengeance on the Jedi. It wasn't about balance or revenge or even ruling. Ruin's new Sith were not united under a philosophy of strength through conflict as the Brotherhood of Darkness would one day be, or through cunning as Darth Bane would later restore. Darth Ruin's Sith were unique. Ruin's Sith were united by belief in one being. That being was Darth Ruin. And the longer that they followed him, the more they realized something was terribly wrong. To Ruin, the Sith were not allies, not students, not even tools. To Darth Ruin, the Sith were nothing, and he made no secret of this belief. To Ruin, they were fragments of a failed galaxy, lesser shadows orbiting his brilliance. They existed only to reflect his power, to affirm his vision. Where previous Sith sought to strengthen their apprentices, Ruin belittled his. Where most Sith demanded loyalty, Ruin demanded irrelevance. He didn't even call his apprentices at all. He called them squires. Ruin was not interested in building an empire that would last. He was interested in proving that he was the only being that was worthy of the Force, and that all others were expendable. Even his chosen squire, Erraticus, was never truly trusted. Ruin saw him and all others as placeholders, manifestations of a reality that only existed to serve his self-mythologized ascension. This wasn't just tyranny, it was theological madness. And the longer his cult served him, the more they began to suffer. He began to sacrifice followers without explanation, executed loyalists at random. He would test their faith not to purify them, but to affirm his own importance. And when the whispers began, when the other Sith began to fear what would consume them all would be some sort of ritual that only Ruin knew about, some self-deification, Ruin did not address them. Because to him, there was no threat. To believe anyone else could betray him meant believing that someone else even mattered. And this is what made Darth Ruin really terrifying. Ruin wasn't pretending to be a god. He believed he already was one. In the end, Ruin's reign was as brief as it was apocalyptic. He had accomplished the impossible, the resurrection of the Sith. He had forged them into a single coherent ideology for the first time in centuries. He had sparked a galactic conflict that would become known as the New Sith Wars, a war that would stretch across 1,000 years and see the Republic collapse into fear and chaos. And yet Ruin himself would not live to see the first of any great battle. He was too certain, too invulnerable in his own mind. He held his disciples in such low regard, he viewed them as literal nothings, that he never even considered the possibility that they would strike out against him. His single-minded philosophy of self-interest, his absolute monomania, he was consumed by the one thing that even the Sith cannot discard: caution. And so quietly they conspired, not for power from their master, not for vengeance, but for something far more pure: survival. His followers had tracked him across dead worlds, believed in his message, surrendered their autonomy to his will, but now they feared for their existence. Some of the Sith believed Ruin intended to drain their life essence in a ritual to transcend the mortal plane. Others believed that he had already begun. Whether these were delusions or well-founded truths though, it didn't matter. The cult that he had created, the galaxy he had rebuilt in his own image, turned on him. And Darth Ruin, the philosopher god who believed he alone could wield the Force, was murdered. Not by the Jedi, not by the Republic commandos, but by his own followers. And he never saw it coming. because how could nothing kill a god? Ruin's legacy did not end with his death. If anything, it only began here. The Sith had reawakened, and they would continue to wage a war on the Republic for 1,000 years. His cult would fracture into new sects and new warlords, each echoing pieces of his vision, but none holding it completely. Because how could they? The Republic would be dragged into century after century of conflict. Jedi armies would rise and fall, and darkness would settle over the galaxy like a plague. Ruin's madness became a virus, and the galaxy became the virus's host. Though he never raised a fleet or conquered any world, Ruin's beliefs, his certainty in his own supremacy, this ignited a conflict that would take a millennium to extinguish, and by the time that war finally ended at the Battle of Ruusan, the Sith were thought destroyed for good. Only one, though, would remain in secret, a Sith who understood exactly what had gone wrong. Darth Ruin left the Jedi Order to pursue his own philosophy of self-interest, and gave rise to a 1,000-year war that concluded at Ruusan, and who was among the last to hold the Darth title, until I have claimed it again. To Darth Bane, Ruin was both a warning and a lesson. A Sith who shattered the Jedi not by war, but with words, and united the Sith not with fear, but with faith. But also a Sith who fell not to his enemies, but to his own delusion. Where Ruin believed in self above all, Bane believed in the system, the rule of two. He forged it to correct the chaos that Ruin had spawned. A system where every Sith would be tested through combat, survival, not through worship. But perhaps the most haunting thing about Darth Ruin is that he almost succeeded. Had he not fallen into madness, had he not dismissed his own followers as insects, he may have reshaped the galaxy forever. He may have become the living nexus of the Force that he had imagined. A god in all but name. Because in the end, Ruin didn't fall because he was wrong. He fell because he believed only he could be right. So remember this, the Sith do not always rise with fire. Sometimes they rise with thought. And the Force does not always serve balance. Sometimes it becomes a mirror, one that reflects back only ego and those that dare to claim it. Darth Ruin didn't need to kill to corrupt. He just needed to convince you that no one else mattered. And in a galaxy ruled by belief, that is all that it takes. Honestly, in my opinion, Ruin may be one of the most genuinely insane and terrifying Sith in all of the Star Wars mythos. Yes, Sidious was a manipulative monster. Vitiate literally consumed worlds. But Ruin wasn't just evil. Ruin was gone, completely out of his mind. He didn't just believe he was right, he believed no one else even existed in any meaningful way. That's what makes him so scary. He didn't want to rule the galaxy. He wanted to erase it and replace it with himself. We remember the fall of Anakin Skywalker not only because it led to the rise of Vader, but because of what it cost him. Padme, his soul, and eventually, the bond with his son. He spent years as a weapon of tyranny before finally remembering that he was a father at all. Even Dooku, before he became Tyrannus, carried scars from his childhood. His own father, a noble of House Sereno, cast him out as a boy when his Force sensitivity was eventually discovered. His father left him to die in the cold wilderness. Dooku only survived because of the Jedi that found him first. It was abandonment in its purest form, a wound that would never close. These men, Vader, Dooku, they represent what happens when power, trauma, and legacy intersect. But neither of them are the worst father in Star Wars, because unlike them, he never failed to love his children. The worst father in Star Wars never intended to love them at all. The being most of the galaxy came to know as Valkorion was not born with that name. He began as Tenebrae, the son of a Sith Lord and a frightened peasant. He was a prodigy, a dark side phenomenon who killed without remorse even as a child. By the time he was only 10, he had enslaved an entire world. By 20, he had drained its life entirely. Nathema, reduced to a dead, silent planet of nothing. It was even absent of the Force. He then became Vitiate, Emperor of the Sith. But even that title, like everything else he had ever touched, was only temporary. Tenebrae had no use for names. He only needed masks. Centuries later, when his immortality began to fracture, he set his gaze on a new world, Zakuul, a world rich with potential, a people unspoiled by Jedi or Sith doctrine. He didn't conquer it, he joined it. There, Tenebrae found a man named Valkorion, a great warrior of Zakuul, a man loved by his people. Valkorion was charismatic, powerful, and most importantly, he was close to the throne. Tenebrae hollowed him out. Tenebrae didn't just kill him, he suppressed him, body, mind, and soul. He wore his skin like a cloak. He became the immortal emperor. The people of Zakuul would never know that their hero was gone. Instead, they would worship the god that now wore his name. Valkorion was dead in every way that mattered, but the nightmare was now only beginning. From his throne in the spire, Valkorion Tenebrae created something new. He created the Eternal Empire, a civilization unlike the Sith Empire or the Republic, a society that rejected the binary Jedi and Sith, and in doing so, attracted followers from across the stars. But this wasn't peace, it was dominion through silence. Zakuul was a utopia on the surface. Beneath it, surveillance, obedience, and the cold weight of a god who did not age, nor did he err, but he did not feel either. To cement his illusion of humanity, Valkorion took a consort, Senya Tiral, a gifted warrior of the Knights of Zakuul, and with her he had children. But this was no act of love, it was an act of design. He would create not a family, he would create weapons. Arcann and Thexan, twin sons of Valkorion, were born into what should have been nobility. They had access to education, power, prestige, everything a royal child could dream of. But they were not raised as sons. They were raised as instruments. From the moment that they could walk, Valkorion demanded strength, composure, obedience, seeing that emotion was weakness and compassion was a failure. And yet, Thexan was calm, focused, gifted, and seemed to thrive. In contrast, Arcann struggled. He was impulsive, emotional, desperate for approval, of which Valkorion gave him none. This was not a mistake, it was intentional. Valkorion praised Thexan openly, letting Arcann drown in envy. He fostered their bond only to destroy it later. When the Eternal Fleet launched into its first galactic campaign, both brothers led the charge. They fought as one, conquering world after world in their father's name. But Valkorion saw that unity and he hated it, because Arcann's loyalty was not to his father, it was to his brother. So Valkorion withdrew, and in that emotional vacuum, Arcann unraveled. Jealousy twisted into hatred. Hatred fed into rage, until in a moment of fury, Arcann struck down his twin. Thexan died, Arcann wept, and Valkorion watched in silence, saying nothing. This had been the goal all along. Arcann would be broken, wounded, traumatized, pliable, the perfect heir to a legacy of domination. Arcann had become just like his father. But things were only going to get worse. If the tragedy of Arcann and Thexan was that they were forged, the tragedy of Vaylin was that she was shattered. From the moment of her birth, it was clear that Vaylin possessed power beyond reason. Even as a toddler, her sensitivity bent reality. She could tear apart soldiers with a thought. No child in the galaxy matched her potential. Senya, her mother, was terrified. But Valkorion had something strange happen here. He was terrified as well. Vaylin was wild, but more importantly, she was herself. She laughed, she played, she showed love. These were things Tenebrae could not understand, and therefore, he could not tolerate. And so he acted. He returned to Nathema, the world he had once consumed as vitiate, a place of death, of silence, of rituals long buried. There he imprisoned his own daughter. In underground laboratories and shrines, cultists tore into her mind. They buried her identity beneath layers of trauma. They instilled mental blocks to contain her power. They isolated her from her mother, her brothers, and even herself. And when it was done, when the child Vaylin no longer remembered how to be happy, Valkorion returned. She was colder, she was dangerous, she was now a blade, no longer a girl, and Valkorion only could smile. What makes Valkorion the worst father in Star Wars is not just his cruelty, it's the purpose behind it. He did not hurt his children because he failed. He did not abandon them in fear, anger, or guilt. He hurt them because he had always intended to, because they were never people to him. They were contingencies, experiments, and vessels. In each one of them, he embedded a piece of his power and a shard of his madness. Arcann inherited wrath. Thexan inherited loyalty. Vaylin inherited his forced dominance, but all three inherited his emptiness. Valkorion created a family in the same way he created an empire, as a means to an end. And once they were no longer useful, he was prepared to discard them, just as he has discarded the Sith, the Jedi, and even the name Tenebrae. because he didn't believe in legacy. He believed in consumption. Valkorion didn't just fail his children, he didn't even want them to survive. They weren't born out of love, they were raised for legacy. They were designed as prototypes, vessels meant to serve a purpose, then to be discarded once that purpose was done. Arcann, Thexan, and Vaylin were only tools. They were viewed as weapons wielded by a god, wearing only a father's skin. And like all weapons, they were eventually built to break. Arcann's fall was not an accident. It was the result of emotional starvation, a jealousy fed to him by the one man whose approval he desperately craved. Valkorion never offered it, because a child who feels unloved is easy to control. Thexan, who may have balanced his brother's darkness, was eliminated the moment he showed loyalty to someone other than his father. And Vaylin, she was the ultimate failure of love. A daughter who was too powerful, too brilliant, too wild to manipulate. So he destroyed her before she could bloom. He didn't teach her to control her power, he taught her to fear it, and then made her fear herself. Her eventual madness wasn't her fault, it was inherited. To call Valkorion's children a family is almost dishonest. Families are built on connection, shared pain, shared joy, shared humanity. But Valkorion did not share anything. He installed himself into lives like a virus. He was the static center they revolved around, but never reached. They were siblings by blood, but strangers in spirit. Each of them isolated by design. Arcann was turned inward, consumed by resentment. Thexan was pushed towards noble obedience, then he was killed for it. Vaylin was turned into a weapon, then locked away in case she pointed back. They were never allowed to heal together, never allowed to grow together. Valkorion didn't just destroy their relationships, he made sure they never had one to begin with. Valkorion didn't raise a family, he raised ghosts. And even when he died, Valkorion was not done. His spirit lingered, whispering into the mind of the Outlander, appearing in visions, invading dreams, taking on the shape of a father, a mentor, a god, whatever the situation demanded. This wasn't legacy, this was a haunting. Valkorion did not believe in letting go, because to let go is to admit that you're not in control. So he stayed. He stayed in Arcann's guilt, in Vaylin's pain, in Senya's nightmares, and even in the final days of his existence, when he reached out from the void to try to remake himself through Satil Shan, he wore the same stolen face, the same voice, the same lie. He didn't want to live again. He wanted to continue to control, because if he couldn't be their father in life, he would be their god in death. What makes Valkorion the worst father in Star Wars isn't just what he did to his children, it's what he believed about them. To him, family was not sacred. It wasn't love, it wasn't duty, it was only strategy. His children were not people, they were extensions of his will, temporary stages in his pursuit of divinity. Valkorion believed that love was weakness, that one's identity was malleable, that a soul could be overwritten. He didn't nurture children, he infested them. And in doing that, he passed on not just power, but his brokenness. He passed on his void. The rage in Arcann, the madness in Vaylin, the grief in Thexan, grief that ultimately cost him his life. He didn't give them life at all, he gave them a poisoned inheritance. Vader destroyed his family through fear and failure, but in the end he chose love. He chose his son. Dooku was abandoned by his father out of fear and a misunderstanding about the Force. Even Palpatine, as monstrous as he was, never pretended to be anyone's pure parent. But Valkorion was something else entirely. He didn't forget he was a father. He rejected it. He weaponized it. He made it something terrible. He created children knowing that he would break them, knowing that he would throw them away, knowing that they were stepping stones to godhood. He wore their pain as an armor. He used their love as chains. And when it was all over, he left behind not a dynasty, but a crater. A crater where love should have been, where legacy should have stood, where children should have lived. He didn't raise them, he ruined them, because the worst father in Star Wars was not a father at all. Did the most evil Sith Lord in history actually legitimately love his wife? Greetings again, Acolytes, and welcome back to the Archives. In the time when he was preparing for his invasion against the Republic, Darth Vitiate would become distracted by another special interest somewhere deep in wild space. Once again splitting his mind, his will, and his power, the Emperor would take the body of the Zakuulian male by the name of Valkorion, assuming his identity and establishing the Eternal Empire. Eventually, he would even end up marrying a woman by the name of Senya, who would be the mother of his children, the twins Arcan and Thexan, and the incredibly powerful and volatile Valen. Senya seems to recall a time when the two were actually quite happy together, which prompted us to ask the odd question: did Valkorion actually grow to love Senya? Was he capable of having any sort of normal relationship, care, or concern for his wife or family? Or is it simply that he was too far beyond human? Was he too far beyond her? Well, the histories tell us something a bit different, my friends, and just like with all things in Sith culture, marriage was not as straightforward as you may think. So now, it's time to merge love poems and the dark side chanting as we dive into the complicated mind of Emperor Valkorion. Marriage within Sith culture is one thing that isn't often explored, but it was something that did happen. Of course, we know this by the time of Vitiate when he became Valkorion. He had dismissed most of the practices of the Sith. During the days of the Old Empire and Vitiate's reconstituted Sith, marriage happened there all the time, but just behind the scenes most of the time. The Sith were an elitist culture, and like with any social hierarchy-based system, bloodlines were incredibly important to them. Legacy meant a lot to the Sith. Where a person comes from can determine their place in the hierarchy of the Grand Empire, again, it being structured around that. The family was very important, and marriage was rarely something done out of love, as such a concept of love was considered weakness to Sith. Instead, it was done by selecting a partner with sufficient strength in the Force that would produce even stronger offspring to bring glory and power to the family name. Everything about Sith culture was based around power plays, and marriage was no different. If any emotional feeling did exist though, it was more than likely a carnal passion. Spouses were usually expendable to one another if they believed it would further their own glory or their family's social power in the Empire. This is how it was viewed, purely transactional. But Valkorion was an interesting being, because he had all the power that he needed. He wasn't looking to share or relinquish it to an heir. Being a man with an insufferable god complex, he saw all other beings as ants beneath him with their only meaningful purpose to serve him. Giving himself over to a partnership like a marriage was more than likely the last thing on Valkorion's mind. But like with many of these perspectives, this would change all around the time that he found the world of Zakuul. Vitiate was searching for a method of increasing his power to the level of full godhood, no longer playing at it. He would end up finding and learning about the planet of Zakuul. Zakuul held a powerful, but a rather superstitious race of people. Their home was a steward to an ancient secret. That secret was the Eternal Fleet. The Eternal Fleet was built by an unknown race long ago. And because of being the stewards of the fleet, the Zakuulians had grown into one of the most powerful fighting forces in the known galaxy, and they could wield the Force. But the fleet itself could be controlled on a central remote known as the Eternal Throne. This, along with various other mystical weaponry, drew Vitiate's attention to the world of Zakuul. He became fascinated with their culture. He wanted to design a legacy that would be everlasting, but one where he would never pass away. He would position himself as the savior-like figure of the Zakuulian people, as they were extremely religious and zealot to their emperor. And he threw away the shackles of Valkorion being a simple leader, instead declaring himself the Eternal Emperor. His consciousness and power now inhabited the body of Valkorion, and he began building a new empire away from the Sith that he had already constructed. The Eternal Fleet, though, was his secret weapon, highly advanced, fully automated, and created by the Eternal Empire of Zakuul. Unlike other traditional fleets, it didn't rely on living crews at all. Its ships were rather piloted by sophisticated AI, allowing for perfect coordination in battle. The fleet's tech surpassed both anything the Republic and the Sith had ever made, and the sheer size and precision enabled the fleet to overwhelm entire systems extremely quickly. It served as the backbone of Emperor Valkorion's domination and his strategy, making him nearly unstoppable during this period of time. For hundreds of years, he would split his attention between the Eternal Empire and the Sith, until the time came for the invasion of the Republic and the known galaxy to take place. The Great Galactic War began, and it looked as though the Sith were going to have a swift victory. They had managed to catch the Republic by surprise at Korriban and had started plowing through the Outer Rim and the Mid-Rim territories with deadly precision and focus. Valkorion was focused on Sith and Jedi alike, and since the war was going extremely well in his favor, Vitiate focused his attention back on his preferred project, the Eternal Empire. As the Jedi and Sith were tearing each other apart, Vitiate found that he would build the power of his nest egg. But it didn't just end with the fleet. Valkorion was beginning to build an eternal army for his inevitable appearance in the near future, and it was here where he would meet Senya Tyral. Senya was powerful, strong-willed. She had risen from the Knights of Zakul. Unlike the other knights though, who drew their power straight from the Emperor, Senya was naturally born Force-sensitive. Her potential in the Force was great, and placed her directly within the Knights of Zakul, as she rose to be one of the best fighters among them. Her connection to the Force was pure, untethered by any greater power. Soon, she was inducted into the Emperor's elite guard, but Valkorion would take notice of her until she distinguished herself with a sharp tongue as well. He never hesitated to speak to her, and Valkorion felt that he could be honest with Senya, especially during meetings of war. Senya would often speak out against replacing human soldiers in military positions with the droid skytroopers, something that Valkorion agreed with. This caught the Emperor's attention, and he became intrigued by this woman. Valkorion was perpetually surrounded by sycophants and yes-men who either feared or adored him completely. Not that he minded such a thing, but a lot of them were just a little bit too obedient. They were worker bees to do his bidding, and they never gave him any sort of pushback or even question any decision he ever made. But Senya would. Senya was not afraid of him. She was not afraid of the better idea and the better idea becoming known. Someone who actually cared about the state and the strength of the Empire enough to challenge one of the Emperor's very decisions. But rather than seeing her as insolent, Valkorion became infatuated with her strength. He had convinced himself that he was a god, and that everything else was just a mere ant. And yet, one of these ants proved that she did not see herself as a commoner, but one worthy of respect, even from a god. 2 years would pass, and the two would become romantically involved. They would marry, and Senya went on from the elite guard to Queen of the Eternal Empire and the Eternal Throne. Although we think of Valkorion as being cold and a heartless creature, Senya does not remember him that way. She would later actually recall that the two had been happy together once. However, she would specify that it wasn't all hearts and roses. Valkorion wasn't that type of being. Nevertheless, their marriage was a good one, at least for a period of time. According to Senya's words exactly, she would describe their time together by saying this: "What we had wasn't a child's notion of romance, but we were happy. Then Arkan and his brother Thexan were born. I loved them so much, but no matter what I did, they never wanted anything to do with me, and Valkorion wanted nothing to do with them. It was exactly at the birth of their children where everything would go wrong." Right after the twins' birth, the war with the Republic had reached an issue. Before, the Sith had been steamrolling them, winning victory after victory, gaining more and more territory. However, the Jedi had now rallied the Republic armies as one force, and had stopped the Empire's advance dead in its tracks. More, they were beginning to become stronger, and now were launching a counteroffensive that was pushing the boundary line back against the Sith. Vitiate, the Emperor, was forced to pull his concentration away from Valkorion and his body, and back to the Sith Emperor body where he could give direct orders through his many voices. Although Vitiate was capable of splitting up his mind and his power between several vessels, his attention and focus was a limited commodity. And from what we currently understand about him, the bodies he inhabited could operate independently from him, but without his attention, they sort of went into an automatic pilot mode. The lights were on, but no one was home. When this happened, they were completely devoid of any kind of expression, and would carry out Vitiate's pre-purposed plans until he shifted his focus back onto their body. He was always aware of what they were doing, because they were still him, but they could only have his full attention in one place at a time. Because of this, the once affectionate Valkorion that Senya had known suddenly became withdrawn, distant, dangerous. She never knew why he became this way so quickly, in fact, too, how he appeared depressed, and how he disregarded their children as nothing. Senya attempted to show her sons love and acceptance, but the boys completely ignored her. They idolized their father, they craved his approval and praise, a longing that the twins would be denied of for their entire lives. Despite the hard-headedness of her husband though, Senya still had yet another child with him, their daughter, Vaylin. This time, Senya did everything she could to teach Vaylin not to follow values such as power or strength in the Force, but to desire love, family, and unity. Vaylin, however, figured out her natural power in the Force was beyond her brothers, and watched her twin brothers train, desiring to be just like them. But she was dangerous, even to Valkorion. Eventually though, Vaylin too craved her father's approval, and dismissed her mother. But unlike Arcan and Thexan, her power was too much to control. Even when in the womb, she moved furniture around Senya. But now, as a little girl, she was deadly. There was one occasion when she was playing with one of the Imperial guards, the guard who accidentally dropped the ball. Senya, filled with sadness, reached out with the Force and inadvertently tore the guard's body to shreds. Terrified at this, Senya attempted to help her channel her daughter's power through training, but Vaylin would lose control again and again, killing several Knights of Zakul. Valkorion was there to witness a lot of this, and while he was interested in what his children was displaying and that she had grown so powerful in the Force so quickly, Valkorion was intimidated by her, showing tendencies that reminded her of himself, the young Tenebrae. One day, Senya would go to Valkorion, begging him for help with Vaylin. She was troubled, the guards were terrified of her, and even Senya was terrified to interact with her, to guide her in some way, to show affection, to do anything. But Valkorion had a different solution, to merely cage Vaylin's mind. Locking her power away was the most that he could do. He took Vaylin to the world of Nathema, his homeworld now devoid of the Force. He locked her there in the sanitarium, where she underwent brutal mental and physical reconditioning at the hands of the Nathema zealots, transforming Vaylin from a sweet but a troubled girl into a psychopath devoid of empathy. Sensing her daughter suffering from the world though, Senya decided that she would rescue her from Nathema. Despite Senya making it all the way there and fighting her way out of the sanitarium with her daughter in hand, Vaylin refused to go with her any further. When she was locked away, the girl blamed her mother for all of her suffering, believing that her mother saw her as a monster to be caged away. She now felt nothing but hatred for Senya and stayed behind at the sanitarium. At that moment, Valkorion emerged and had Senya taken away back to Zakul. The Imperial Queen now saw that her husband was a madman and felt as though her children no longer were safe with him, as she attempted to take them with her and run away from Zakul. However, after Senya reached out again, both of her sons and Vaylin again refused. They called their mother weak and remained devoted entirely to their father. Now vowing to bring an end to Valkorion's rule and to save her family, Senya departed to join the resistance. Valkorion did not stop her from leaving, and he wanted to focus on keeping his powerful children in control. To Valkorion, the importance of his children goes beyond their power. It is that they are perfect vessels for his spirit to inhabit should it ever require it. This is why he keeps them so close. They are some of the only bodies in the entire galaxy that could inhabit his powerful spirit. But to return to the core question, did Valkorion actually love his wife Senya in any capacity? Well, I would say no. I do not believe that Valkorion has the capacity to love, as he stripped himself from all feeling in the process that granted him immortality, all the way back during the ritual of Nathema. The only thing he felt now was the hunger for power and the fear of losing it. From the evidence from the story that it presents, Valkorion's infatuation with Senya was just that, a special interest simply because she displayed desirable traits and a strength in the Force that was unnatural. There is nothing to suggest that Valkorion truly cared for his wife though, and I do not place a lot of stock in Senya's opinion that they were once happy. She specified that they did not have a child's idea of romance, likely meaning that their union was devoid of any typical rendering of affection, mutual decision-making, and meaningful time spent with one another. It was rather an act of duty. I believe that Valkorion likely saw her the way that he saw the Sith Empire that he had left behind. A fascinating, but an ultimately failed experiment, one which did provide usefulness and entertainment, but ultimately something that he would tell you that he outgrew. We cannot forget that the Emperor is a cruel, a heartless entity. His heart is black, devoid of the capacity for light even. He feeds on the very Force itself, and desires peace in the galaxy in the form of total silence. Familial and marital love have no place within a creature of the dark side such as this. In all of the vast history of the Sith, few stories are quietly as tragic as that of Darth Treya. Before she ever donned the title of Dark Lord, she was Kreia, a wise and respected Jedi historian whose only crime was teaching her students to question, to search deeper, and to truly understand the Force in all of its complexities. Among her students was Revan, a prodigy whose hunger for knowledge mirrored her own, and the Jedi Council chose paralysis over action. It was Revan who finally stepped forward, determined to save the Republic himself. herself. But what began as fierce defiance became catastrophe. Revan fell to the dark side, and in the aftermath, the Jedi Council needed someone to blame. It was Kreia who they turned on. They exiled her, claiming it was her teachings that had unleashed the greatest threat the galaxy had ever seen. And in that moment, the seeds of her lifelong doubt, her suspicion that the Force itself was an indifferent manipulator, took root and grew into an obsession. Cast out by the Jedi and betrayed by the very order that she had served, she saw answers where no sane mind would ever look, on the dead world of Malachor V. Here she would encounter the dark side not as an abstract concept, but as a palpable will, embodying beings who had completely surrendered to it. In them, she saw everything that she feared, that sentient life was nothing more than a pawn to a cosmic power, without morality or without mercy. This is the story of Darth Plagueis, the teacher condemned for her students' sins, the philosopher who dared to challenge the will of the Force itself, and the tragic figure whose life became a testament to betrayal, sorrow, and the dangerous pursuit of forbidden truth. From the very beginning, Kreia was never like the other Jedi. While her peers studied the Force as a means to serve destiny, she quietly wondered whether destiny itself was a prison. Born with an uncommon sensitivity to the currents of the Force, Kreia became a historian and a philosopher, driven not by ambition or conquest, but by a simple, unquenchable curiosity. She believed knowledge was the highest virtue, that understanding all sides of the Force was the only true path to wisdom. It was this devotion to understanding, not power, that led her to train some of the most brilliant minds the Order would ever produce. A student whose questions mirrored her own, and whose hunger for purpose would one day shape the galaxy. When the Mandalorian Wars erupted, Kreia watched in silent frustration as the Jedi Council refused to act, paralyzed by their faith in destiny. To Kreia, the cost of inaction was measured in the lives of worlds. Yet, by all of her doubts, she never forced her students down any path. She simply taught them to question, to think beyond the rigid dogma of the Jedi Order. But while Revan returned from the war as a Sith Lord, the Jedi Council turned their fear and shame into accusation. Kreia was branded the architect of his fall, the corrupter who had poisoned a generation with dangerous ideas. In truth, Kreia had only ever tried to help her students find their own way. Exiled and alone, Kreia began to wonder if her lifelong suspicion had been right, that the Force was no benevolent guide, but an indifferent force, shaping destinies without care for those who suffered in its currents. While the Jedi clung to the belief that the will of the Force was inherently good, Kreia could no longer accept that the tragedies of her life were necessary, or even meaningful. She asked herself a question no Jedi dared. What if destiny is simply another kind of slavery? In the end, it was this quiet defiance, not malice, that set her on a path to Malachor V. There she would confront the darkest truths that she could find, and would eventually become Darth Plagueis, the teacher who sought to tear down the Force itself. But before this life as a Sith Lord, Kreia was simply a woman who refused to surrender her mind to fate, and whose greatest sin was asking whether destiny was ever truly worth following. But it wasn't merely exile that kindled her rage, it was the hypocrisy that defined it. For decades, the Jedi had encouraged her to search the archives tirelessly, to dig into forgotten histories and uncover secrets that they themselves were too timid to face. Whenever she brought them new discoveries, they would praise her. They called her a scholar, a visionary, and yet the moment she dared to question whether their teachings were truly complete, whether even the Jedi were sometimes blind, they instantly branded her a heretic. All that she had devoted her life to, her rank, her identity, her purpose, was ripped away in an instant. They didn't exile her from the Jedi, they exiled her from everything that she had ever been. In their eyes, she was no longer Kreia the respectable historian, she was nothing but a dangerous voice, one better cast into silence than allowed to challenge the comfort of their dogma. It was in that emptiness, in the quiet after her life had been burned to ash, that Kreia made her fateful decision. If the Jedi would deny her the knowledge that she sought, if they would call her dangerous simply for thinking, then she would embrace everything that they had forbidden. She would not shy away from the dark, she would master it, not as a slave, but as an equal. She believed that by understanding the darkness as fully as she had once understood the light, she could finally see the Force without illusions, without grandeur. But the deeper she went into the secrets of the dark side, the more Kreia realized that the Jedi had never been her true enemies at all. They were only pieces on the board, pawns, just like the Sith. Her real jailer had always been the Force itself. It was the Force that had guided her students into war, that had elevated Revan to a hero and then a monster, that had placed her on a path only to break her. It was the Force that authored every triumph, every tragedy, indifferent to the suffering that it caused. And so she came to believe that her destiny was not just to defy the Sith or the Jedi, it was to liberate the galaxy from the tyranny of destiny itself. But to do that, to challenge the Force, she would have to claim the very power that she despised. She would have to wield the dark side as a weapon, not merely to conquer others, but to free them. In that conviction, she ceased to be Kreia. She became Darth Traya, the betrayer of all creeds, and the herald of a final war against the Force itself. Driven by the conviction that only absolute knowledge could free her from the Force's manipulations, Kreia set her course for a world that the Jedi had long sealed away in fear. Malachor V. This place was no ordinary graveyard. It was the epicenter of Revan's greatest crime, the site of a superweapon that had torn a wound in the Force, one so deep that it bled into every living thing that came near it. When she first set foot on the shattered surface, she felt it immediately, a deafening silence beneath all sound, the echo of countless lives extinguished in an instant. It wasn't just a battlefield. Malachor V was a scar on reality, and it was within that darkness that Kreia sensed another figure. Two presences, twisted, hungry, and impossibly strong, Sion and Nihilus, Dark Lords of the Sith. To anyone else, this would have been their end. Sion was death made flesh, a creature who refused to die no matter how many times he was broken. Nihilus was worse, a wound in the Force given consciousness, a void that devoured entire worlds. But Kreia did not come to Malachor as a conqueror. She arrived as a student. She opened herself up to the dark side, listening to its secrets, its mysteries. In the catacombs of the Traius Academy, she unearthed knowledge the Jedi had buried for millennia. She studied the rituals that gave Nihilus his insatiable hunger, and the dark arts that bound Sion's will to his shattered body. She learned the ways of the Sith not to surrender herself, but to understand, to master every doctrine, every heresy, every forbidden truth. And in time, she saw that her will was stronger than theirs. Through cunning and hindsight, Kreia did what no Sith before had ever achieved. She dominated both Sion and Nihilus, binding them to her purpose. She became their master not by brute force, but through the clarity of her vision. Where they were slaves to their hunger and their hatred, she was something far more dangerous. A mind that refused to be broken. A philosopher who would wield the dark side not for conquest, but to destroy the Force's hold over all of life. Yet, even as Kreia mastered the darkest secrets Malachor had to offer, she found no satisfaction in any of them. If anything, her study of the Sith only confirmed her most dreadful suspicion, that the dark side was an infection as much as it was a power. To wield it was to surrender something essential, to hollow out the self in exchange for the illusion of strength. She saw it mostly in the wretched forms of her apprentices. Sion, who was bound by his broken flesh together with sheer hatred, was a creature in perpetual agony. Every moment he continued to exist was a testament to how complete the dark side had consumed a person. And Darth Nihilus, the void in human shape, was perhaps the ultimate expression of the dark side's hunger. He had become nothing but appetite, stripped of name, stripped of memory, stripped of soul. In quiet moments, Kreia sometimes felt a flicker of pity for them. She understood, perhaps better than anyone alive, that their monstrosity was not simply a choice, but the final consequence of surrendering to the dark. But whatever compassion she may have held was buried beneath contempt. For all their terrible power, they were still slaves. Slaves to their impulses. Slaves to the Force. Pawns on the same board she had spent her life trying to escape. It was then that Kreia began to see the dark side not as an answer to the Jedi's blindness, but as another prison, one even crueler than the light. While the Jedi clung to the delusion of moral certainty, the Sith clung to suffering and the worship of their own pain. The Force corrupted both paths, elevating those most willing to sacrifice everything that made them human. And so in the end, Kreia's hatred grew to encompass not only the Jedi, but the dark side itself. She realized that every philosophy, every doctrine of control, compassion, conquest, or peace was just another mask for the Force's endless cycle of manipulation. To her, there was only one escape left. She would have to use the darkness, but never surrender to it, because if she did, she would become another monster, another pawn in a game that she no longer believed in. And so Kreia did what no Sith before her had ever dared. She used the dark side not because she believed in it, but because she had concluded it was simply another mask that the Force wore. A mask she had to master, so that she could better hope to rip it away. She looked at Darth Sion and Darth Nihilus and saw not just monsters, but victims. Victims of the same cosmic cruelty she had known her entire life. They were beings who had tried to take control of their fate, only to become more enslaved than anyone. In that way, she almost pitied them. But her pity was always laced with contempt, because even in their horror, they still served the Force. They were examples of what the Force did to those who reached for too much power. Cautionary tales masquerading as conquerors, and in her eyes, their endless hunger and suffering proved a truth no Jedi or Sith could ever admit. The Force used everyone, in every era, without purpose and without mercy. This was the revelation that set Kreia apart from every teacher and tyrant that came before her. Where the Jedi called the Force balance and the Sith called it strength, she saw only manipulation. To Kreia, it was neither a god nor a guide. It was a cold, indifferent will that elevated heroes and monsters alike, only to then cast them down, feeding on the endless cycle of hope and then despair. And that is why she believed her crusade was necessary, not simply to punish the Jedi for their hypocrisy or the Sith for their arrogance, but rather to free every living being from the invisible chains that bound them to a destiny that no one had ever chosen. She would become the instrument of that liberation, even if it meant becoming the greatest heretic the galaxy had ever known. Because in Kreia's mind, there was one more terrifying truth that no prophecy could ever erase, no victory could ever conceal. The Force itself was the villain in all things. But anyway, my friends, I hope you enjoyed this look and dive into the philosophy and mindset of Darth Traya and Kreia, certainly one of the most tragic Sith in all of Star Wars lore. She is one of the most compelling figures in the entire galaxy because she defies every expectation of what a Force user should be. She is neither a selfless Jedi nor a power-hungry Sith Lord, but something altogether more complex. A woman who has seen the failings of both paths and refused to accept either. Her life is defined by exile, betrayal, and the relentless search for meaning beyond dogma. This unyielding skepticism makes her feel more human and more tragic than almost any other character in the mythos. Her philosophy that the Force itself is an oppressor, a hidden hand that manipulates all life, shatters the comforting simplicity of the light versus the dark in all of our minds. Kreia challenges the idea that destiny is noble, or that surrendering to cosmic will can ever be called true freedom. In her eyes, the galaxy's endless cycle of war and suffering was evidence of a moral failing, but proof that the Force is a prison, one masquerading as enlightenment. Few characters in the franchise ever confront the very foundation of existence with such clarity and with such bitterness. In the end, Kreia's story is both a warning and an invitation. It warns of the dangers of blind faith, whether in tradition, power, or destiny, and it invites every being to question who they are without the Force's influence. Her legacy is the uncomfortable realization that perhaps the most heroic act is not to obey or to conquer, but rather to choose freely, even in the defiance of the universe itself. This is what makes Kreia unforgettable. She is a philosopher and a heretic, a mentor and a destroyer. And above all, Kreia is a reminder that true strength is born in the struggle to create one's own purpose. There comes a time in every student's life when they witness the true, unfiltered expertise of the one who is teaching them. In the case of the Sith, this moment comes when the master must flex their full power in the dark side for the student to witness. In some cases, it's to put their apprentice in their place, or in other cases, it's because they have no choice in a life or death situation. It was for the latter reason that Darth Sidious would finally feel the true power of his own master, Darth Plagueis. For decades, the Moon Sith Lord had wisely kept his strength a secret, never showing more than what was necessary in order to train his young pupil. But there came a time when Plagueis had to throw all pretense aside to save himself from certain death. And when that happened, we get to see Palpatine's sober reaction to a power greater than his own. Greetings again, lore junkies, and welcome back to the archives. In today's holocron, we will be revisiting the Darth Plagueis novel yet again in order to explore what happened after Palpatine felt the true strength of his master for the first time. One of my favorite moments in the entire novel. The event would come sometime in or around the year 52 BBY. Palpatine and his master, Higo Damask, the alter ego of Darth Plagueis, had garnered themselves some enemies during their political schemes. Those enemies were the Grand Protectorate of Malastare, a group that had been slighted by Plagueis one too many times. They had already sent a hit out on Palpatine which had failed miserably. But the hit they sent out against Higo Damask would be carried out with much more efficiency, and it nearly succeeded. The men sent after Plagueis were the Maladian Assassins, an order of warriors who took the art of assassination as a religious practice. They were known to always carry out their contracts, and had even wounded and been known for killing Jedi Knights. And while they had no prior knowledge of Damask being a Dark Lord of the Sith, they did not balk at the idea of fighting Force sensitives whatsoever. With their intense combat training and their ability to work together seamlessly, they were extremely formidable enemies, even for a Sith Lord. Higo Damask had been invited to attend a ceremony within the order known as the Canted Circle. This was a secret society made up of only the topmost elite of the entire galaxy. Plagueis himself was not an official member, however, as he did not want them digging too deeply into his past and his personal life. But because of his great influence, he was treated as an honorary member and was invited in some of their most important ceremonies. In this case, Higo Damask was attending the ceremony of his good friend Larsh Hill. Larsh, who had unwittingly done much to aid the Sith cause. Hill was being inducted into the Order of the Canted Circle. But this would be where Plagueis would get much more out of the evening than he originally bargained for. The Sith Lord would be tested in a way that he hadn't been in decades. Everyone wore ceremonial robes with hoods pulled up, as was custom for the secret society. But unbeknownst to all of them until the very last moment, the Maladian Assassins had infiltrated the Order of the Canted Circle, and had disguised themselves within the robes of their very members. During the ceremony, Plagueis felt the dark side wash over him like a wave, alerting him to the imminent danger. Rather than act on his instinct, however, Plagueis suppressed his impulse so as to not prematurely reveal his true nature. This would prove to be a fatal mistake, however. In an instant, the Maladian Assassins decapitated Hill and sent dozens of razor-bladed discs flying around the room. Almost every member of the Canted Circle, including the Sun Guard standing watch, were murdered instantly within a matter of moments. Plagueis of course managed to dodge, but because he had restrained his natural instinct and the indications that the dark side had alerted within him, a decapitator disc had made off with a considerable portion of the moon's jawbone and his neck. This resulted in his trachea and several blood vessels being severed in the process. The assassins pulled vibroblades next, and proceeded to go around butchering anyone still standing. Plagueis, however, managed to somewhat heal his neck enough in order to keep from lapsing into unconsciousness. There was no use in his hiding his true nature now. He had to fight for his life. And so, the Dark Lord unleashed the powers of the dark side. Across the city in the Senate office, his apprentice Sidious was relaxing from his evening. He was still riled up from having nearly been assassinated himself recently, and at that moment, he was feeling some venomous things towards his master. He felt as though he was being denied secrets of the dark side that he was owed. He wanted to know when he would become the master. He began to wonder if Plagueis was keeping powers secret for himself, hoarding them away. It was just then that Sate Pestage burst into the room without warning. Sate Pestage is someone you may recognize as being a sycophant of Palpatine's. But before those days, he was simply one of many contacts that Darth Plagueis had. Yet, he was also one of a small handful of individuals who was aware of the Rule of Two, and Damask and Palpatine's true nature. It was something that Sate Pestage kept on the down low, and did not discuss with the two Sith Lords, but it was a silent understanding that they had between each other. Plagueis often trusted Sate Pestage with ordering the Sith's dirty work to be done, and some time back, Sate had also hired the Maladian Assassins to take out a political enemy of Palpatine's. Unfortunately though, that mission went awry, and the assassination was botched. In humiliation of how the mission had gone, the Maladian captain felt that as penance, he would disclose some important information to Sate. Sate would then tell Palpatine that the Maladians were hired to kill someone affiliated with the Mask Holdings, and he had thought that that individual was Palpatine. Sidious, now fully armed, turned himself to the view window of his office, and opened himself fully to the dark side of the Force. It's worth noting that Palpatine was taught to suppress his nature in the Force by Plagueis. He had this natural ability to do so, but when he refined it, he was able to bury his own inner darkness so deep down that it could not be sensed even when he was in a room full of Jedi Masters. However, this came at the cost of his own perceptions and ability to use the Force, so he was often blind to the things happening around him until he actually opened himself up again. And when he did it this time, the power that he felt nearly took him off of his feet. This is what the novel reads. Palpatine paced away from Pestage. He opened himself fully to the Force and was left staggered by an inrush of overwhelming malevolence. He planted his left hand on the desk for support and managed a stuttering inhale. Somewhere close by, the dark side was unspooling. Despite being a Dark Lord himself and one of significant evil, Palpatine was left staggered by Plagueis' malevolence. That pressure and sheer presence of his master's power in the Force drove the air from his lungs and made him nearly fall over. Palpatine in this moment had several things running through his mind. Firstly, his master was in danger, and he had to run to save him. Not necessarily because he didn't believe his master could handle it, but because he had to make sure that the Jedi didn't get there first. Second though, he was taken aback by Plagueis' power. Long had Sidious wondered if his master was holding out on him. He had seen the Dark Lord's strange experiments, and knew that he had big dreams of controlling the nature of life and death itself. But as for how far those developments had come, Palpatine didn't really know at this point, and wouldn't know for about another 2 decades. Yet now one thing was for certain. Plagueis had been holding back, and he finally had felt proof of that. But rather than Palpatine fearing it, having anger or jealousy, he felt only awe, and later he would hunger to possess that same power. Palpatine and Sate rushed off to the Phobosi district of Coruscant, hoping that they were not already too late. Meanwhile though, Plagueis had already jumped to his feet and was snapping bones, smashing skulls, and punching straight through the chestplate armor of the assassins. This was Darth Plagueis, Dark Lord of the Sith. It didn't matter that one of his 3 hearts had already failed him. He was gushing blood from his neck. He would teach these lesser beings what they had made, and the last mistake of their entire lives. Every object in the room became a storm of deadly projectiles. Plagueis' Force lightning boiled the blood inside of their bodies. The Maladians, being professionals that they were though, did not shirk at the Force powers, but simply were forced to change tactics, coming at Plagueis from various angles and waiting for openings. Another of Plagueis' hearts would eventually fail here as well, nearly paralyzing him with pain. But the Dark Lord managed to throw up an impenetrable force barrier and release a scream with his damaged vocal cords that shattered every eardrum in the vicinity. Another wave of power caused an earthquaking tremor in the floor, one that took the assassins off of their feet. And with a blast of raw power, Plagueis atomized the bodies of several more of the assassins, Starkiller style. Plagueis was moments from unleashing hell on his remaining attackers with what little energy he had left. That was when Sidious and Pestage entered the room. Sidious went to his master's side and aided him with his own powers in the Force. Pestage wielded a repeating blaster rifle that would lay waste to all of the stragglers. Within moments, the fight was over, and the 3 men were standing ankle deep in blood. Now that Pestage had witnessed their true natures without a shadow of a doubt, he was officially brought into the fold of the Sith. Sidious rushed to his master's side, told him that they had to leave at once, stating that he had felt Darth Plagueis through the Force, and that the Jedi would have felt something similar. However, Plagueis was momentarily delirious from his loss of blood, and fully enmeshed in the powers of the dark. To Sidious's statement, he said this in a raspy voice: "Let them come. Let them inhale the aroma of the dark side." In his aggravated state, Plagueis had more than a moment and forgotten the importance of secrecy. Having nearly died, he relished in the idea that the Jedi would be forced to walk through a toxic cloud of pure darkness, one created by his own power. But Sidious acted as the voice of reason, imploring his master once more. He said that the carnage around them was beyond explanation. They could not be there. And after a moment, Plagueis seemed to come to his senses and nodded in agreement with his apprentice. The two hurried out to escape the crime scene and to get Plagueis some much-needed medical attention. But while the Jedi would not be inhaling the aroma of the dark side this day, someone else would, the Grand Protectorate. And their fate would come at the now blood-raged hands of Darth Sidious. Sidious, who would carry out the judgment of him himself. But anyway, my friends, this was the frightening moment that Palpatine felt the full power of Darth Plagueis. I love this moment personally because the mere feeling of Plagueis' ability shocked Palpatine into being a voice of reason. He was so sobered by what he felt in the Force that he had enough clarity to realize that the Jedi themselves would have also undoubtedly felt it as well. Fearing the safety of the rule of 2, Palpatine had to convince his own master to leave the bloodbath. Meanwhile, Plagueis, who was barely functioning at all, his very respiratory system failing, he was ready to throw down with anyone else who wanted a taste of his power. But this moment would stick with Palpatine for the rest of his life. This was the first time he got to experience the unfiltered pressure of what a true Sith looked like, and his desire to achieve that sort of potency would never be satisfied. Witnessing what he and his master did that day with the Force may be one of the reasons that he would later tell Vader that the Sith had grown beyond the use of lightsabers entirely. But what do you think about this, my friends? Do you wish that we got more visceral descriptions of what Sith Lords and Jedi Masters actually feel in the Force as they experience it?